All right.
I hear footsteps. Welcome. We waited for you.
Task force members walked in.
Now we can definitely start.
Anybody who's attending who's not MVP staff, please sign in just when you're here. Can I get a confirmation from one of the virtual task force members that you can hear me? Thumbs up or something?
Oh, we remember you.
Good morning, this is Quinn Griffith. I can hear you well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Quinn. That works just as
I'm sorry, Lori.
All right.
Hi, Lori.
Lori, nice to meet you in person.
Yeah, right here. You're right here, Lori. And we can, if you guys want to cards around, you're welcome to spread out. So in fact, let's just do that, Lori, and give you more space. There you go.
Okay, well, while we get settled,
There you go.
thank you for the members of the task force who are in person and virtually, members of the public that are here in person. We also have a number of people registered and signed up online. And thank you to all my colleagues who have helped make this meeting, or help with the logistics of this meeting. So we're today, our third location, we're in Maryland Department of Planning's offices at State Center. We're going to be doing meetings here probably in the foreseeable future, so we encourage people to come down and visit us. I will turn over the introduction portion to Chair Secretary Ford.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone out there in virtual land. And thank you to all of you that made it all the way to our State Center offices here in Baltimore. Thanks for being here. So lots to cover as always, full 3 hours. I'm sure that's very full. And so we, I would say thank you for the staff for pulling the materials together, and my apologies to everyone. We're just doing the best we can to get stuff out to you all. And I'm sorry it's not, as early as we would like, and things just keep coming. But, I think the communications hopefully lets you know that things are coming and what's going on, everything. So hopefully you know that we're working as hard, trying as hard as we can for all of that. As we get into this, particularly the people in the room, feel free to get up and go around. The restrooms are just down the hall and to the left, and the emergency exits out that way also. And with that, I think, Joe, let's go ahead to the agenda.
Well, I want to make one introduction as well.
Oh, okay.
We'll start. So,
Adam,
our
yes.
Assistant AG, Adam Snyder, has joined us. So I'm not sure if the camera can whip around fast enough to him, but he's over there. I want to thank Adam for joining us. It's been mentioned a couple times both times in our previous meetings that it would be good if we had some legal counsel, legal representation for some of our questions. But I want to be clear that Adam represents the Maryland Department of Planning. He does not provide legal guidance to Maryland jurisdictions nor to the task force, right? He's here to answer questions, help with research. But I also want to point out that, he may not be able to answer all questions. It may be desirable that he doesn't try to answer questions on the fly today. As you all are probably very well aware, legal questions can be very tricky and complicated. So if something comes up, he will research it and get back to us. But I want to appreciate Adam. Did you want to say anything, Adam?
No, I think you covered it. I'm glad to be here. Interesting topic.
All right.
Great. So let's just do a quick roll call. So we have everyone else identified that's here and for the record. And so I'm just going to go down through my list and just basically let me know if you're here, which I think I know, but just to be absolutely sure. And then we'll dive into the overall agenda. So first of all, Senator Washington.
Present here online.
Great. Delegate Stewart. Not yet. Secretary Flora here. Theo with Housing Community Development. Great. Theo's here. Laurie with Permitting Inspections.
Here.
Here you are. Representing MACO though.
That's correct.
Correct. Yes. Amy Mordock. Okay. And that's the MACO Rural County rep. James Gaston, MML Urban Municipality rep. Any sign of James?
I'm here.
Oh, yes. Great. Thanks, James. Great. Councilman Hoff. I know he had some other commitments and might be coming in and out today. He's the MML Rural Municipality rep. And we have David Thaler. I think, David, you're online.
What's online?
And David's the Maryland Building Industry Association rep. I'm pretty sure David's out there. Maybe still on mute. we'll confirm that in a bit for the record. Tiffany Harris with Maryland Association of Realtors. Hey, Tiffany. Quinn Griffith with the Chesapeake Region Chapter of Community Associates Institute. Quinn, I know you're out there,
Here.
right?
Yes,
There you are.
correct.
Thank you. Okay, Deborah Bulow with American Institute of Architects.
She was
Deborah,
emailing this morning confirming the location, so I think she probably.
she might be coming yet still. Okay, great. Priscilla Kanya with AARP. Not yet. Mandy Gitt with Maryland Coalition of Interior Designers.
Present.
Mandy's here. Great, thank you. And Priscilla, hi Priscilla.
Morning.
And let me see, on to Jennifer Ray. Oh, I love this description. I'm going to read this, Jennifer. I think you should take your name back with you. An individual with professional experience in planning and development of roads and highways. And you know, I remember when this came up and we were just bound and determined to find the right person to fit that description. And I believe you are it, Jennifer.
I'm here.
Thank you. Chelsea Heyman with the Department of Disabilities. Chelsea, thank you. And Isabella Shykoff with the Department of Aging. Isabella, anywhere? No. Okay. Okay, I think we have nearly everyone present. So thank you all once again. And we still may have a couple more coming and going, and our team will just keep a record of that. So we have it for the minutes. So Joe, I think we're ready for the agenda now.
Okay, well, we just went through the welcome and overview. Brief administrative updates following that. And we'll, as we'll do every meeting, we'll have a brief recap of what we heard at the previous meeting. I want to focus on the meeting and research plan that I've added a lot more details to. I gave you a really loose outline last time. I want to go into detail about that. As we discussed previously, we're going to give some more details on the housing market analysis plan today. I'll plan for that. And then we're going to be touching on our first topical topic today, which is by right conditions and special exceptions. We're going to have focus topics for each meeting moving forward. Then we'll have public comments and our summary and final.
Great, thanks, Joe. And just for the group out there, Joe and I are going to do a bit of a choreographer here. Joe's going to lead the team, taking us through the informational, and then I'll facilitate our discussion because we do have some pretty critical discussion points on this agenda. And those points, we're going to today, now this is our third meeting, and we've had a lot of opportunity to, I think, look at all of the different aspects and lenses of this topic we're dealing with. But today we're going to start focusing in. So there may be occasions where I say, not our agenda, not our objective. We can record it, but we really need to start focusing because we only have a few months now to really begin to start each meeting coming out with some very clear outcomes. And so I will have that lovely task of trying to focus us in, making sure we have outcomes from today's big outcome, which is the by right conditions and special exceptions focus of the discussion, where we want to have some outcomes. So you can see we've allowed an hour for that particular time. And I am not going to be assuming we're going to necessarily have full consensus on everything. We're going to vet things and we're going to reach a point where we feel like we have some sort of consent or some kind of general, yeah, this is where we landed on this, and we'll do our best. And then ultimately we have to produce a report. So that's why we're going to start really pushing now for some key outcomes. So just with that introductory, I'm going to turn it back to Joe to go over the administrative updates.
Okay. Some technical issues, but we're working through it.
There's always technical issues. We just go with the flow.
Oh, wait. Oh. Hold on. Make sure that.
Let me pick it up. If you can advance the slide, I can go to the next one.
All right, so the meeting objectives.
Yeah, why don't you do what you're doing? I'll go through this.
Okay.
And then you can take care of their item. So each meeting, we're trying to be very clear about what is it we want to come out with. I just kind of noted that a little bit, but we really need this work plan for completing. So I think one of the questions asked, which is a very good question at the last meeting, is, okay, so where are we going? What's our map? What's our roadmap? How are we heading forward? So trying to give you all a better sense of what we envision, but to be able to share that with everyone else. And then the housing market analysis itself that DHCD has been taking the lead on. Preliminary legislative and policy recommendations related to zoning use and approval processes. Compile a list of best practices for local governments that address the practical issues and receive, review, and discuss public comment. So these are all the objectives we're focused on. And Joe, I'm sort of, as I read these are today's meeting objectives, or these are the overall meeting objectives? Because some of these sound like they're overall.
No, these are, I mean, a lot of them would be beginning or starting to, but these are today's objectives.
Today's, I want to be very clear.
So we have these topic areas, right? We're going to be doing zoning use and approval processes today, by right special exceptions. We're going to be talking about lot sizes, eventually utilities. For each of those, we're going to be trying to build the outline or the initial components of the final report, right? And these are the topic areas that you'll see in the inventories, both the state and Maryland ones. So by no means the legislative and policy recommendations, the list of best practices related to this topic are going to be finalized today. But we are going to be starting from now because we don't have much time, right? It's June 1st that this is due. We need to really start building this report. We had a lot of good introductions to our conceptual framework during the first few meetings, but the work starts now. We'll see how far we get.
Well, the work
Maybe I'm a little
started.
ambitious.
The work started 6 months ago, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah. Work
Go
on the
ahead.
actual report. Okay, so just a reminder about public comments. We accept public comments at the end of the meeting. There is an online comment form. And there was some confusion about this last one, so I just want to be clear. The members of the public joining online can submit their comments via the chat function. We say that every time. However, we're not unmuting those joining online. So please submit your comments online using the chat function or go to the comment form.
And those all get recorded and shared with the full task force, correct?
I don't think we shared the chat last time. That's a good point.
Yes, that is the total transparency. We have those and they're available to ensure that they're incorporated into our thought process.
Okay. All right, so administrative updates. We talked a lot about financial disclosure exemption requests. So I have good news at its November 16th meeting. The State Ethics Commission considered the exemption request and approved the exemption request. It concluded that the task force functions in an advisory capacity only, and there was no other compelling reason that would require disclosure. So some of you might have already submitted them. I know there's been a lot of emails about that, but you are free from that requirement. However, they wanted to clarify, they wanted to be specific that the task force remains subject to other requirements of the ethics law, including the conflicts of interest provisions found in subtitle 5. Right, so that would be related to the other conflict of interest email that you may also receive. If you have any questions, you can send them to me, but I'm going to send you to Jennifer Algier, the executive director of the Ethics Commission, because I cannot answer details about subtitle 5. But if you're still questions, please let me know, and I can connect you with Jennifer. Okay. We're going to talk about this more in detail later, but you should have all received emails from the group and panel assistance. This was one of the next steps last time, so just want to put that out there. We will be coming back to it. We've seen a few public comments, both in the chat and online, about the desire for those speaking to cite their sources. And I know, we get in these discussions and dialogues, and you say something, but if you have sources or examples, specific details about where your statements are coming from, we've got a number of comments to that effect. So just a friendly reminder about that the public is interested in those sources. And then last time we mentioned the report on activities, and we shared it as part of the agenda items. It was submitted to the Governor and General Assembly on November 1st, its due date, which was one day after the last meeting. So there's a link to it here. It's also found on the website if you're interested in reading the report on activities. Any questions about administrative updates before we continue? All right, we're going to do a quick recap. And you all check if there's anything online. Everything good online? Okay, so we talked at length last time about the task force needing to consider the legacy of racial housing policies in its deliberations and its recommendations, and that this, that's something that cannot be overlooked. In response to that, I did work with colleagues at DHCD, and I did contact Oregon State University's planning department seeking someone to come speak to the task force on this. They gave me a lead. We followed the lead. Unfortunately, we cannot get that individual to present to us today. But this was a very strong recommendation of the task force last meeting. So if anybody in the task force has a recommendation for a guest speaker to come to one of our upcoming meetings to address this topic, we would appreciate that help.
Virtual or in person.
Virtual, that's a good point. Yeah, they could join virtually.
I also have a great webinar that I have just identified also that we can also just use as another approach.
So yeah, please let me know. Let Secretary Flora know, and we would definitely want to track somebody down who can fully speak to that. All right, we talked about zoning authority as local, but we also talked about state delegation of that authority. We're going to go into more detail about that today. There's a mention about we need to consider the strong and well-purposed and needed environmental and natural resource protection regulations in Maryland and how they impact ADUs. This has been said multiple times, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that we always have to keep in mind the cost of municipal services on ADUs. We need to make sure recommendations are informed by data. We got clarity on the scenarios exercise, so thank you, Jennifer. I know we have some follow-up to do on that. We talked a lot about the groups that we need to continue to engage, and this will be reflected in the focus group and panel plan that I sent you all, and I've asked your help on. But those were housing advocates, community organizations, and HOAs and environmental groups. And there was a lot of discussion about our recommendations, our best practices, the things coming out of this need to be tangible and usable by local governments. In our final wrap-up discussion, we'll talk about the need of universal design and discussion about the problems of Euclidean zoning when it comes to ADUs and many other things. We're going to touch back on that today. There was a strong interest in a panel discussion of planning directors for jurisdictions that have implemented ADU ordinances. We are aiming to have that meeting in December.
Joe, let me just interject too. Some of these special panels may need to happen outside of the meetings because we only get to have one meeting a month and we've got to produce something. And so it's very possible that if there are special topics or panels, we may have to do those as add-ons, as virtuals for people to tune into to just kind of get the information. Because I think we're going to run out of time if we try to add too much in to the working meetings that we have remaining, but yeah, it's important. So I just want to heads up on that.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
just to be clear, it's Senator Mary Washington here. I'm attending virtually. Would the chair consider appointing subcommittees? I think that would be within your authority. And I know I'd be interested and willing to serve in order to get the work done. So just, I know this is a report out period, but perhaps given that there is so much work and it absolutely cannot just all be done during these meetings. So that's all I wanted to see if you would consider that, or if we already have committees.
We are actually in the process of setting up, I think, volunteer groups that are leading the way. That Joe, I don't know where you're going to cover that in the agenda.
We're going to talk about a lot of these ideas. I have some ideas myself, on how we can approach this, and I've emailed a lot of you everybody about it. I wouldn't call it subcommittees, but that could be
Work groups, working.
Let's keep going on the outreach or the summary, because I want to make sure everyone agrees with what our summary is. And then I think in terms of our methods of ensuring that we're capturing everything, we'll pick up on that later, Senator Washington, because I think we are trying to leverage all of the sub topics, areas, and expertise that we can as efficiently as we can. And Joe will touch on that more later.
So quickly, we talked about the importance of the glossary, and staff agrees. We're going to be slowly starting to develop that, make sure we're all speaking the same language, but that's also included in the final report. We talked about life safety and ingress and egress needs. Something we're going to talk about more about today and probably throughout, this tension between state mandates and local implementation of new regulations. That's something we can't lose track of, and that there's an abundance of information out there about ADUs, and that it may become redundant, and we need to focus on what's most applicable to our work. So That being said,
So before we go there, just
Oh.
any, our team we have multiple people taking notes. But I just want to confirm that we are providing you with meeting notes, which you received. These are not minutes to approve. It's more of just a reporting of what occurred, because then that gives us something to go back to as we do start writing the report. So I just want to do a check-in. Is there anything that anyone feels we grossly missed from this summary, either in the notes or on this quick overview, that we may have missed from last time, or anything that might be an error from last meeting? And you can always let us know later, since we're not approving minutes, so to speak, but just want to take that moment before we move to the next item.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
hi. I know it's difficult, these hybrid meetings, trying to figure out how to be recognized. I believe we had a discussion, and I think it was significant, about the historical sort of legacy. I'm not quite sure how you want to incorporate that, but I do believe that that was a really important component of our meeting, with that particularly when we're talking about zoning. There's not just the Euclidean aspects of it, but they're sort of our.
Yeah, that was in the very first bullet. Joe, can you go back? Consider the legacy of housing policies, and that's where we were talking about reaching out to have a guest speaker. So that was definitely recorded, and clearly is a lot of why we're where we're at today. So does that reflect? I mean, we didn't try to capture the entire conversation, but reflect the fact that it's an issue.
Okay, I'll just make a recommendation. I don't want to stop that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, if you want to do a follow-up of some additional information, actually, absolutely welcomed. I just want to make sure that how we incorporate that and any of this information into a ultimate report versus an appendices or recommendations of further study to be done. There's a lot of ways we can handle things that we may not be able to precisely in our charge respond to. So just keep everybody in mind with that. Deborah.
Just a quick question. So I know that you emailed individual groups about the different topics. Do we have access to the other groups and what their topics are? I maybe you said that.
Yeah, it's in if you look at the research plan I sent, you'll see names.
Okay, next to
the individual, either focus group or panel. Those are the individuals assigned. If somebody wants to trade or something, we can do that, but
okay,
it's in that, it's got a one page on the top.
okay, because I had some thoughts that I thought might be more relevant to other groups, but I can touch base with you.
Yeah, I tried to assign, well, feel free to talk to me. I'll get to it when we talk
right.
about that for you. But yes.
And that was one of your attachments for today's meeting. So you should maybe have seen that. Yeah.
The research plan, the housing market analysis plan flow from SB 382 requirements. So we had I think it was like the day after, I think DHCD and MDP staff met. And we had a lot of conversations, a lot of good conversations, but we wanted to make sure things are focused on what the bill is requiring. What does this task force need to do? And we kind of really drilled it down to the bolded things here. This is just pulled directly from the bill. These are what we need to develop, right? So legislative and policy recommendations and best practices. Those are the key things that this task force is to develop. And in developing that, they need to consider practical issues and the impacts on local housing markets and neighborhood livability. So when you look at the research plan, a table, it tags them based on these different requirements.
And specific to accessory dwelling units.
Yes.
You're not going to solve all of the housing issues in Maryland in this small task force. So we really need to keep it specific to accessory dwelling units, which I would bold also.
Right, so this is just a screenshot of the full document I sent you. So this would be the qualitative research approach and plan. This just shows, I just want to talk about how this is organized. The full thing includes all of our meetings. So here we are today, right? That's our focus areas. They were focusing on housing market analysis, by right conditions, special exceptions. There's some prior meeting research work product. A lot of that, most of that's going to be staff, but some of that's going to be the focus groups. We'll talk more about what we're going to be doing during the meeting. And then those tags based on the bill I just meant, or what the bill says. So the housing markets, neighborhood livability, best practices, legislative policy recommendations. So it's organized around the specific requirements of the bill. And then there's some core objectives there. And you would have seen these core objectives in the objectives I showed you on the second or third slide. So we'll do that each time. And then there's the assisting task force members. There's the names right there. So that's where you'll find them. Again, if somebody thinks they should be in another group, I try to assign people based on where I think their area of expertise would lie. Some people weren't easily categorized based on the topic area. So I'm happy to be flexible. All right, then the specific focus groups, panels, and surveys. So there are a lot of groups mentioned last time. And as was previously discussed today, we have limited time. This is due in June. So some of these we moved to surveys. And one of those would be the builders and developers survey. I sent you all a draft of that to use, put in a Google form. Happy for any feedback on it. And then we're going to do one for environmental groups as well. We just don't have enough time to do everybody. So we prioritize panels, focus groups based on what we have and these topic areas. So next time, we're going to have the planning directors who have recently implemented ADU zoning changes. We're going to have to be a little flexible on recently implemented here. And a number of you have already started giving me some suggestions. Amy. So that's a panel discussion. Panel discussion means in meeting. Focus group means before meeting. So before the January meeting, we're going to have a focus group of ADU owners, residents, accessibility, and aging advocates. So yes, like was mentioned, we can't do everything during the meeting, so this will be early January, and then that will inform the discussion during the meeting. We go back to a panel discussion with community associations and HOAs on parking, facilities, and code enforcement. And then finally, our final focus group when we get to the March meeting will be with housing organizations. So that's how we organize it, and then we'll send the builders and developers surveys soon, and then the environmental groups will probably send like January. So we have some discussion questions here. So does the task force have any questions about the request for assistance specifically? Because you've all received requests for assistance from me. I know there have been some questions about, what's the language we should use, and I can still develop more of that after today. Do you have any suggestions for the research approach that has been expressed that I've described now and is also more fully detailed than we've received in the agenda packet? And then we're going to ask your help in distributing the builders and developers survey to the broadest possible audience, because I don't just have a distribution list of builders and developers. So we would definitely like your help. So happy to.
So let's break this down. So go back to the table of the research plan. So this is, next, the one before that. Okay, so that's just the first couple.
Yeah.
Today's meeting's the next meeting. You all had the table. So as you can see, and as Joe described, but just to make sure we're all following this, we've broken that down into what can happen within these different types of forums, focus groups, panels, task force. Is everyone following that? Anyone have any questions about that? And then, and I'm looking online. Does anyone see any hands up online or anywhere? Making sure we're covering everybody. So that's the method.
Do we know who yet we're gonna have for the panel discussion? I mean, I know my two, but I don't know.
I've got some suggestions from a few task force members that have been assigned to that one. I don't have a final list yet, but I also have some as well that based on the survey survey we sent over the summer, but I wanted to give the task force members opportunity to make some recommendations.
How many are we looking for in total?
I don't know if I've come with the ideal number, but it's probably somewhere in the 6 range.
At most, because I find, and I'm sure you all have experienced this if you're on a panel, more than that, you don't really get a word in. So we have to make sure we've got a good cross-section representation, and we're talking closing in on the holidays. So names are good, and we'll get, a representation and the reality of people's availability for that next one.
The one thing that I would like to bring up is particularly in my county, we don't have this, but our planning directors want to participate, not only to hear,
Mhm.
but, and why it's not, why it's not an option in the county, that's a bigger discussion. But I do think if we're going to consider, my panelists will kind of be more of a listening
Okay.
versus actively participating. So I think that's something that we should kind of think about. So if
Interesting.
we're having, because ultimately, if we're going to make a recommendation and some things are going to have to go through, county
Mhm.
council approval through the planning department, they should be part of it, at least at listening.
So I think it's a really good thought of maybe there's a core panel that's a cross section, but then there's a special invitation. Maybe that's something you could help
I'll
us
talk to
with
Joe about it.
to ensure that the others are invited to listen in, go into the chat, whatever, to say, hey, no, that's not what we're seeing, but we sort of have the primary speaking come from that core group. I think
Okay.
would that, I think, help us.
I think that would be helpful because if they do
Yeah.
want to participate, but their concern is that we're
Sure.
not going to really add much substantive. I mean, there's
Yeah.
historical information,
Mhm.
but because it's not something that's
Mhm.
approved.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Something I forgot to mention in the administrative section or here was the team site. So hopefully you've all been able to access the team site. There are focus group / panel discussion plan documents for each of these groups in there that I should have shared a link with you. I'm going to talk about the housing market analysis plan, which will include core questions for each, but you have suggestions on people, you can email them to me, but you can also add them to the attendees on those Word documents and any additional questions.
And can we treat that Word document sort of like a,
Here.
well, like I'm just giving you my thoughts. It's not a final, it's like brain dump. Can we treat it as
Yes.
a brain dump? Okay.
Please do. Please do. Of course, there's going to be planning meetings and discussions in the lead up to focus groups or panels to make sure everybody's on board. Yes.
Any other thoughts, questions about this approach? Keep in mind, this is what's coming up. And then you all should have the full list, and if you see yourself being able to support any of these other topic areas. The topic areas were based, I mean, it could have been endless, but the topic areas were based on very specifically, staying focused on what our assignment is. And then there will be other kinds of input, but that was intended to stay focused on the assignment. So other basically questions about the approach, the matrix, assignments, just reach out to Joe directly. If you see yourself fitting somewhere else, or if you, say there is no way I can help you with this, let us know. But that'll just help, I think, make sure we're casting the net as wide as possible in these specific topic areas. So any questions online that I'm missing, or hands up? Okay, then I think we're good.
And I will say, sorry, for those members of the public who are joining virtually and in person, you can find the full documents on the meeting materials. They're linked in the presentation too. So if you want to see the full research.
Okay, so the survey, Joe, before we leave this section altogether, the game plan for the survey is, as Deborah mentioned, it's online. The task force is welcome to add comments, or what's your game plan on that? To get it out.
Those comments like pretty soon. this
Yes,
week.
let's set a time frame.
Yeah, so by the end of the week, if you have any comments, what I sent you is a PDF. You can comment on the PDF, but you can send me emails. Questions, I would like to send it out over the next week.
How are we sending it out?
Google form. So I'll put it in a Google form and then I'll send you the link to everybody. And then I'm going to ask your help distributing it
To
to,
builders, developers and architects.
it could be a broad.
Right, you're
I
right.
would never not.
We usually leave planners off the list.
We already surveyed the planners.
Okay.
We did that in July.
So should we say design professionals, to be fair? Maybe, would that be reasonable? Because that's kind of a,
I know, it makes it really long.
I trust our task force members' definition of what should fit in that survey. Just don't send it out to everybody, because we really do want to, it has very specific questions to that target audience.
okay.
All right, now we're going to look at the housing market analysis plan specifically. So there isn't a whole lot of available quantitative data out there, but I do want to talk to you about what we're working on and what we've received so far and how we're going to hopefully use it. So, we did make multiple requests to planning directors or planning contacts that completed the survey over the summer if they had any permitting data. we got limited responses. I think it's often ADUs aren't tracked distinctly from other housing units. But I'll give you a few examples. Rockville responded. Since 1990, they've had 34 applications, 29 which have been approved, 1 dismissed, 1 denied, 3 withdrawn, and 6 licensed as rental units. Right, so this idea of licensing rental units is something that this group could consider. And Rockville specifically, they do not permit detached ADUs, not even by special exception. We're going to look at that a little bit later. There's another jurisdiction that has the same limitation. Anne Arundel sent us information from 1991 to now, 123 permitted, 6 active, 2 under revision, and 3 closed. And they provided us information by zoning district, which I just got yesterday, so I need to look at it more closely. But which zoning districts, so we could do an analysis of which zoning districts in Anne Arundel had the most ADUs. And then Calvert also sent us information. It's more current, 2020 to 2022, 14 issues, 23 processed, 9 finalized.
So Joe, how are you summarizing these pieces that are coming into you that we'll be able to sort of see them as a total somewhere?
The idea, I still need to fully figure out how I'm going to do this, but I want the quantitative data we do have, we'll talk about some more here, is use that as an input into the focus groups. Because the housing market analysis, there'll be questions for each focus group that are going to help us build the housing market analysis. And I want to use this as an input. Just kind of a first thing for people to chew on and perhaps respond to each part. And we may still get more for.
So will the task force see a summary of what you're reading off there somehow?
Yes, yeah, I'll pull together, hopefully by the December meeting, maybe by the January. All of this is going to be included in part of the record, I just need to compile it.
Okay.
Isn't that what your Excel spreadsheet is, the state ADU legislation?
Well, that is just the ordinance. That's not that, those are just the ordinances, like where they're permitted, what their process is. It doesn't actually give you counts of what's been constructed. So they're kind of, they're going to be worked together, but we have a lot more information about the ordinances than we do about what's actually been permitted. I'm still working with the State Department of Assessment and Taxation about how they assess what, I don't think we're going to get a smoking gun here with SSTAT. I don't think they doesn't appear that they track ADU specifically. They may track conversions, and they have some responses that make me seem that they're not going to be able to measure that incremental increase in assessment based on ADUs, but we're still working on it, and we hope to have more. And then Susan, if you want to talk about the Montgomery County does have an ADU mapping. I'll quickly bring it up.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, Montgomery County has a mapping.
Susan, can you step forward so that everyone is able to, especially people online, can?
Are those joining online seeing the map of the mapping program? Yes. We're not going to go into detail about this. It's something we need to explore, but Susan will.
So Joe, on the map, what are we seeing though? What's the purple and the red?
So those are locations of ADUs that have been applied for. Montgomery County has this mapping tool for the entire county. It's a product of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs. They work closely with the Departments of Permitting Services. And it looks like online, what we're seeing is that there are about 360 applications in various process points. Some have been approved for licensing, some have been are in process, others have been denied. We're going to work more closely with them to get more information on how this tool was created and what kind of data it might lend to our market analysis. So both of those agencies are involved with the inspection of the units upon completion, one being more or less a building inspection and the other being an inspection addressing the zoning ordinance and those requirements. Again, staff hopes to find out more information about this tool, but we want to bring it to your attention. You can go online and visit this site as well under Montgomery County, Maryland.gov ADUs, and you will find this tool. So this is just another example of where we might be able to get additional data to help inform the market analysis.
So I just wanted to give you all like a head, we're still working on.
So as you go back to that, so those are the three primary sources we're using to get quantitative data in Maryland.
So we're exploring.
Okay, that's what we're pursuing. Are there any other quantitative sources that anyone else is aware of that would give us any particular metrics? Because a lot of what we're going to be dealing with is qualitative.
So I'm not going into detail.
Yeah, I know. I just want to make sure there's nothing that anyone else has to suggest here. Okay, okay, well then.
So we're envisioning using quantitative data to help inform, spark conversation, but for the qualitative portion. Right, so these are the objectives. You'll see these also reflected in, I sent you the housing market analysis plan as well as a separate document. All right, and these are all reflect back on the tasks of the task force, as I showed you earlier. All right, we're going to consider and analyze how policy regulation and implementation facilitate and or deter the construction of ADUs. Evaluate how the construction of ADUs affects the viability and appeal of local housing markets, right? That has a lot of housing market and impacts on local housing market and neighborhood livability. That's included in SB 382. As much as we can, we're going to try to compare and contrast the differing impact of policy versus the market demand on ADU construction. So, how do they work with each other? Which one, and how maybe they work against each other? But that's one of the questions that you'll see in the housing market analysis questions. And then evaluate how ADUs impact.
I have a question. How do you define policies?
I would talk about local policies through, I guess zoning is more than policy, but zoning, something in a comprehensive plan, perhaps local incentives or other educational programs to help boost ADUs or support it. So I guess it's a broader than just policy. That's what I was thinking.
So I was just trying to help with the chair's goal to have focus. And so I wondered with policies, we'll focus just on specific zoning codes, existing zonings that either prohibit or incentivize? Would that be?
I think the big difference, thank you, Senator, is that, for instance, there's other states, for instance, that are actually providing incentive money for people to build these things. I would call that a policy versus a zoning regulation, which is actually more of a law. And so if there are policies out there that are sort of either, contributing or inhibiting the notion of an ADU, we want to know what they are in Maryland, because we're certainly seeing a whole variety of them across the country. I doubt there's many, but if there's any, it'd be good to know what they are out there in Maryland. And then versus, the regulation is almost easier for us to get our hands on because that's much more specific about something that's in a local code.
Right.
And so those will be, I think, very different as we try to tease out. We probably won't be exhaustive, but as we sort of tease out those types of differential and what's working, what's not, how it's being used, I think it'll be part of what we try to go through in this discovery stage. And then implementation, is a whole other thing because, then you might get into like building codes or other type of water and sewer type issues or something when people actually go to construct. So does that help differentiate for everyone?
Yeah, and just to follow up, this is where I wanted to go with the, again, broad, initial goal of considering the legacy of racist housing policies.
Mm-hmm.
My edit to that, or what I was contemplating, was that the sort of the impact of restrictive local zoning regulations, because then that hits, because there was race certainly. But we also, I think, noted about multifamilies, intergenerational family, basically the privileging of single families. So if there's a way to identify specifically, where there are restrictive local zoning regulations, I think that might be good for us to understand what it look like and if we're going to make recommendations in that space.
So I think one way too, if I can sort of maybe kind of build on what you're saying, would be, how can we find out if there's jurisdictions that specifically prohibit?
Yeah, yeah, and then what does
ADU
that look
in
like?
some
Yeah.
way?
Well, right.
Because I think that would be something would be useful too, is
Yeah.
if there's anything on the books that prohibit
Right.
versus other aspects. And so I think we can certainly add that to the question and exploratory process that we're looking at to be able to get a sense of that. And Senator, I want to follow up with you directly on the legacy issues we're trying to undo here too. So maybe you and I can do a follow-up conversation on that, because I care deeply about it. And I did just run across some materials. It would be nice to share with you.
That would be great. And then my one last question, everyone. Sorry if I missed it. Maybe my coffee, I was still working through that. But when you talk, you summarized earlier about the Euclidean zoning.
Yeah.
You were referencing the Supreme Court decision.
Yes.
Is that what you meant there? So just I think in the notes, it should probably, be a longer note so
Right.
that folks know we're not talking about algebra.
Perhaps the glossary will help with that, because the thing I'm also trying to be really careful of is to not use too much planner speakies here. And so I think the glossary will be really helpful for referencing, making those types of references more obvious to the layperson who may read this in the end. So good call. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
With the glossary, and I apologize if it's there and I missed it, but do we have or can we create it as a working document? So as each of us are hearing terms, we can add those in? Or if we have definitions, so it's falling to everybody to help with that?
That's a great suggestion. We could, I think, pretty easily do.
Oh, we can add that.
Start it now.
We can add it to the team site.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll probably create a subfolder that says something like final report or something like that, deliverables, something like that.
Sections and glossary there and start.
I'll put an outline in there too. That's something I'm hoping I can complete.
Yeah, we've had Joe kind of busy.
We only have 3 weeks to September since this one's later. So we'll see if I get the outline done. But yes, I want to, that's exactly what we're.
But I think that's easily something others can contribute towards. We'll put the keywords that we know down as a start point, and if there's others that come up, just go in and add it. It'll certainly help us, if there's things that you think would be helpful. We'll be writing a whole planning course before we're done. So, be careful of that. Okay. Okay, Joe. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, Amy.
Before we leave this topic, and I know that there will be a lot of focus on looking at zoning and prohibitive zoning practices. I think it will be helpful to outline how many jurisdictions have prohibitive practices and what they look like. What I suspect is that is not going to be the norm. I think that will be the exception.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is a gray area that we need to also quantify between what is regulation and what is policy, because there are a lot of incentives built into our regulations that incentivize affordable housing aspects, but they aren't mandated. And so there is a market-driven side to incentivizing affordable options and ensuring that accessory dwelling units are affordable to families. So there are practices that incentivize, say, a waiver of impact fees or a waiver of other fees that are affiliated directly with quantifying mainly affordable housing, not so much specific to what an accessory dwelling unit is. And then also just to mention, in the planning world right now, namely in the critical area, there is an evolving need to clearly define what a dwelling unit actually is.
Interesting.
And this is due in large part to density requirements in the critical area, but also it is due in large part to the impact of seasonal rentals on the housing market.
Right, right.
So there's a lot of, not conflicting, but there are a lot of challenges in terms of how you incentivize, but also how you identify
Mhm,
what qualifies.
mhm.
So again, if we're looking to take a look at qualitative research, I think qualifying those differences are going to be important when we start to hash it out.
And if I could chime into that, when you talk about the incentives, the other thing is you need to make sure that there's going to be some form of enforcement discussion, because whether it's going to be enforcement from a financial perspective, whether, depending if there's going to be tax credits or something to that effect. Also with respect to just either zoning or compliance or neighborhood kind of issues that come along with that. So I think when we do talk about those incentives, we've got to make sure that if there is an enforcement requirement, that it is something that is substantive, not just there's an enforcement, but who's going to enforce, how is it going to happen, and what the fiscal impact is to the entities that are going to be doing that enforcement, regardless of whether it's like the construction, the building, or the actual tax side.
Yeah, I think you both brought up some good points. And as I look at bullet number 1, when we say implementation, facilitate and or deter the construction of ADUs, perhaps, I think policy where we just need to be clear, but I think the other point being made here is, the one of enforcement or maintenance or management, or I don't know how that maybe goes beyond what we could even determine, but certainly.
But well, I would say it's not beyond what we would determine. It would be, if we're going to give some form of policy recommendation or even a regulation recommendation, depending on which county, there's always going to be enforcement of that, right? So how are we going to do it? Again, whether it could be, like I said, a tax credit, but where is how are we going to track that data? Who's going to get that data? What does that look like? So I think maybe we could say policy, regulation, implementation, and enforcement.
I hear what you're saying, and I think this has come up in our previous conversations of that reality. And I think it is why a lot of people are fearful of it, is, that, well, okay, no one's gonna really check to make sure they're doing what they said they were gonna do, right? So I think that might be a key word we need to add here. Yeah, and we'll do our best.
It's an interesting topic, because if you think about it now and how many ADUs exist that were never permitted. There has been no enforcement wherever they're not permitted, where they're not allowed. So now you're talking about a whole different level. And are you going to go back and try to?
No, we're not going to try to do anything. We're just going to try to shed light on the fact that there are complexities with enforcement, just as there are with the regulations. And what we're trying to do is this fact finding of, where have been the biggest issues, what are people finding, what are they experiencing, so that we can be, I think complete in what the experience has been for folks. And I think that is another aspect of the experience that we can't, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, it's varied, it's probably all of the above, but I think we have to share it. That's part of the experience. Yeah. So other thoughts on this qualitative aspect that we're embarking on? And Joe asked you to go back. Yeah, I know you've got a couple more here, but I wanted to make sure that these are good comments that we're capturing. And so let's go to your next one where
So if I may, I've had my hand up for quite a while.
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you all make sure that we're catching, because I can't see the hands up.
I can't see it either.
Can someone try to monitor that? And I'm so sorry, we've kept you waiting.
No, it's quite all right. I want to make sure I'm
please,
clear. There was a
please
comment
do.
earlier about what are certain jurisdictions doing to quote unquote prohibit ADUs.
Yes.
And I would be remiss if I didn't comment about the inner county or inner towns. When the ADU for Montgomery County came out, what they did was just make rules and regulations that would prohibit it, such as you got to have 2 parking spots on the property in order to have an ADU. So in essence, you can't have an ADU. Right. And so I'm working with Mr. Griffin to try to get some of those town managers and or council members from those inner counties in the Chevy Chase area for the February meeting, so they can explain to you the pros and cons of why they addressed the Montgomery County's ADU policy, if you will, in the way that they did. It would seem to be as though they weren't interested in it, but it had more to do with the quality of life of the individuals that are already there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thanks for James for doing that. And thanks for your help on that, because I think it's sort of a de facto prohibiting when you add additional kind of requirements that make it extremely challenging and possibly unaffordable. So all of a sudden these become something that really defeats the purpose of some maybe affordability. So all of those aspects of this is why it's so complicated. But thank you for that. Did anyone else have their hand up that I've missed out there? I think we're good. Okay, so Joe, if you can, I'm watching our time. We're doing okay on this section. So
some of this has already been discussed. So those are the objectives. Now we're going to talk about how we want. So this is all described in the document you received as well. So insert that quantitative data and insights to the focus group discussions and panel discussions as available. There are going to be housing market analysis questions asked of all focus groups and panels. So we're going to go to the next slide. So every single panel is going to have these same questions and then have their own separate questions specific to their topic area, their who they are. So that we're going to build that way. So we'll get to have the housing market built across different representatives. We're going to build as we go, like I mentioned, adjust as needed. You know, we may find after the first focus group, there's some questions just don't work. We'll adjust as needed. Now, really hoping we get an intern to help with this next one. We are finalizing an MOU with University of Maryland for a spring intern. I think it's going to happen. Got to work out some details, yes. This will be a best practices literature review for ADU proliferation and any demonstrated impacts on local housing markets and neighborhood livability. So they're going to look at, you know, from other states in Maryland, what is the literature, what is research showing us about what actually leads to the construction of ADUs? What are the impacts on neighborhood livability? So what kind of secondary research literature is out there? And then all of this will come back to you on April 16th. This is outlined on that research plan. That'll be after all the focus groups, all of the panels, and after hopefully the intern does all the research. We'll bring it back to you, and we're really going to focus on this on April 16th. We will compile and categorize the research, and then we're going to organize it around those objectives that we just talked about in the previous slide. Now, based on what I heard, there might be changes to that third bullet objective. I understand. I think those are good points, but we're going to organize it around those objectives. So that's our approach. Any questions about the approach before I go to the questions themselves? And then these are, if anybody has any suggestions, how to change these are those questions that are going to be asked of every single focus group and panel to help support and build the housing market analysis. So what has the local government experience taught us about ADUs in the housing market? What prevents them from being a viable housing product? And versus what facilitates that as well. So I think a lot of the topics were mentioned about enforcement, permitting, things like that. I think a lot of that will rise to the surface in some of these discussions. These discussions are going to allow for topics outside of just a pure zoning ordinance, right? So hopefully that's what we're aiming at. And what is the interplay of policy or ordinance changes and market demand that gets back to that objective that I know a lot of people talked about in the proliferation of ADUs? How do they impact each other? Do certain policies or ordinances work better in certain types of communities? Right? Because we've heard from a lot of different folks that, you know, not each community is the same, and you know, it's up to the task force to decide how they consider those. But I do want to ask that question. What practical issues associated with development of accessory dwelling units on lands for single-family residential use should the task force address? This is pulled directly from the SB 382 requirements. From your experience, how have ADUs impacted neighborhood livability? And I want to point out that not every single member of every single panel task force will have experience with this. That's okay. And they might have less experience, or they might have seen something from a different perspective, but we're still going to ask these of every group. And then how can ADU policies and regulations be designed to minimize negative impacts on neighborhood livability to ensure that ADUs increase the supply of affordable housing? So those are the questions we are proposing to ask with every single focus group to help build the housing market analysis. Happy for any feedback, suggested changes.
questions, thoughts on these questions? Yes, Priscilla.
So I have a question about like how universal this is, because when we ask the panelists, they're all going to be Maryland people. And we don't have all that much experience in Maryland. There are a lot of other states with others. Is this the kind of thing you'd like me to send to our AARP national office, who is looking at ADUs across the country, doing a whole lot of analysis on these things universally, or do we only care about what's happening in Maryland?
I wondered that also about the questionnaire going out. Is it Maryland only? Are we only looking at people within Maryland to answer these questions?
I don't know if I can answer that question myself. I guess I'll throw that out to the task force. What do you all think?
My understanding is that we are doing a lessons learned inventory of other states. Because we have a lot of that data. We're going to try to pull more, and that'll be more of an inventory of what are the experiences been of other states, but this is very specific to Maryland. Because ultimately, we need to sort of share what the experience has been elsewhere, but we really need to dig in on what are people's perceptions, true experiences, thoughts, and where do we stand now in Maryland? But those lessons learned are in that inventory of other states is going to be invaluable to us ultimately, but not where I envision this going, this particular piece of our work going, but open to other thought on that, because that's more of just what's manageable and kind of where we need to focus in terms of what's the experience right now in Maryland.
Because in most of Maryland is more perception and it's not experience.
I think it's both. I think we've learned that there's a lot of folks that are doing both. I mean, we're just not hearing it all. As I've been out there talking to folks, I think there's a whole mixed bag, and that's just what this will hopefully uncover, is more of what's really going on out there. How much of it is perceived, how much actual, how much is just not even happening because no one's really wanted to put their toe in that water. So I think there's more happening than people realize, and possibly a lot of it is just happening and people are looking the other way and they're like, whatever. Let's just not touch that topic officially. Let's just kind of let it unfold. So I think that's what we're seeing, and this is going to help make that more concrete.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But when we have these panelists come in, they don't necessarily know about the turn your head and look the other way.
Oh, I bet they do.
Do they?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. What would you think, Amy? I bet you're well aware.
Here's my question to that. Are they going to speak publicly about that? Particularly because if there's a side where it's saying, we know it's happening, we're doing nothing about it, that's a whole nother can of worms that, depending on what seat you're sitting in, you don't want to say.
Right.
So I think that information is helpful, but I don't know if it's really going to be open and honest because of the public nature of this task force. So we may say, this doesn't happen here. We don't have an issue here. We may have complaints, but we haven't found it. Or versus, yes, we're just not enforcing it, or we're not addressing it, and we know it's out there. That I think is going to be a conversation that I can guarantee probably will not happen in the public.
Especially if it's prohibited. A lot of zoning doesn't
address it.
Doesn't prohibit it so much as it's more related to the how the zoning is written, as I understand.
But also
it,
approved because if on the plans, it's showing this, it may not be approved because it's not authorized, because this ADU only can be for certain things. So therefore the plans will be changed, so you won't have it. So that's in the development and the construction and the planning stage. So so we just need to kind of think about.
Yeah, I think right now theoretical, right? And when we start getting into some of this, we'll see what unfolds, right? Yeah. Yeah, Jennifer.
I was going to offer, there are also ways to ask the questions so that it's not distinctive of what are you doing, but if this were to be in this area, what gives you heartburn? What are your concerns? We can always freeze and facilitate questions to allow people to speak from their experiences, even if it's not enforced or something else, but just what would give you heartburn. And I like the idea too of the lessons learned from other states, kind of the best practices, but keeping it within Maryland for some of these distinctive, because ultimately the zoning, the regulations, the livability is a Maryland centric
Mhm.
element for us to consider, but take some of these other aspects and bring
Yeah.
them back into.
Tiffany and then Chelsea, and I want to make sure.
Is the plan to share the questions with the potential panelists beforehand?
I never like to do gotcha panels.
Right.
That's not fair.
Yeah.
You're not gonna make any out.
And there won't be time for them to, all panels to address all. Some will be more relevant to some groups than others. Chelsea?
Just to Priscilla's point, and a lot of the accessible ADU developers that I am like generally familiar with do not operate, they don't have their companies based in Maryland, but they are looking to develop ADUs in the Maryland market. So I do think that like, even though we could, obviously these questions are intended to focus on Maryland, it might be worthwhile to also.
Well, we might be able to capture that in the developer survey, though.
Yeah.
I think that might be a place where if you know of specific developers that are, looking at this market, but have identified specific barriers, I think that's something we would want to know, certainly. Yeah. So maybe just kind of post us on that. Anyone online that we're seeing questions? Okay.
I want to point out, like, these focus group and panels, I don't want to feel like we have to be limited to only like the top experts on all these topics, because people that maybe don't have a lot of experience with it, but want to learn more, they might still know the barriers. They still know what they would like to see from the task force, or what they would like to learn. And I think that lack of information or the lack of knowledge can be just as powerful and informative for us as somebody who is a complete ADU expert in all these different categories. I think a blend of both. So while I think the point is well made that, maybe a lot of Maryland jurisdictions don't have much experience with it, I still think that can help us. Just mine.
Yeah. So Joe, I think we're up to the discussion questions next, which we've kind of taken as we go,
Probably done a lot.
which is good.
But
I think one other thought on some of this is that keep in mind, we'll have a report and the report will have recommendations. It's very possible one of the recommendations will be, hey, we found that people really just don't understand this topic. We need to do more education. In which case we're going to have tons of material to be able to turn that into some education programs, work with MACO, work with MML, work with, planning commissioners, sort of figure out how do we. So it's just an example of, there's a lot of different things and ways this comes out, because we may uncover the fact that, well, most people, some are doing it, some aren't, some really don't know. They'd like to know more. And I think that's what we're gonna uncover in that process too. So someone silence, please. Okay, so any other thoughts on this aspect, which is sort of how we're gonna embark on this market analysis component of our charge? Good. Might be a little messy at times, but we think we have a path forward on this, and we very much need everyone's help on the task force to make sure we're reaching these various audiences. And are we planning for these to be virtual? These panels, focus groups, have we thought about that?
we could probably do, I wasn't thinking of them as the full hybrid, the panels are gonna be during.
Hybrid is
Panel's gonna be during these meetings. So
Okay.
it'd be the same thing.
so there'd be like an hour of the
groups-
meeting or something. Okay.
Focus groups I was intending to do is like just normal Zoom meetings. Some people can join virtually.
Okay.
It's not gonna be like-
That's what I was going to propose, is that the focus groups could be focused on just that group, but the task force members might be able to at least listen in.
Yeah, we can make.
That way they're getting the firsthand impression of what's being stated. We'll look at how that gets set up, but it would be just as observers in those cases. And we'd have a couple of task force members who are helping to lead that particular topic. But I do feel that there's a lot to be said for hearing some of these things firsthand on those occasions where they're not going to be here. If that makes, I don't want to put Joe on the spot because he's looking.
We could do that. I mean, it'd be just like a normal virtual
It's a
meeting.
Zoom meeting.
If
If it's virtual, then it should be.
like we're all familiar with now. It just
Yeah.
wouldn't be
Wouldn't be hybrid.
public and the way.
Yeah, we wouldn't do a
bring
big
out all the
setup.
Information from the focus groups to the next meeting of the task force.
Yeah,
And the summary will be made part, be published and all that.
yeah. So we'll look at those formats and how do we ensure everyone really, is able to get the better firsthand sense of those. So great.
All right. So now I think we're doing pretty well on time. There's a lot of time at the end for discussion today because we have some big objectives today. But I am going to run through some of the practical issues as we're supposed to be discussing and considering. And today, again, our topic is focusing on by right conditions, special exceptions, as use allowances and approval processes. So my colleague, David Dahlstrom, was the colonel last time, if you all recall it very well. He put these slides together for me, so, but then on the next ones, he is off today, but, or this next slide. So some of the stuff we've already talked about, this kind of gets back to that glossary thing. But I wanted to set the stage about, make sure we're all on the same understanding of what these terms are before we get into the next section, which is looking at Maryland examples and examples from other states, right? So by right versus special exception. So under current practice in Maryland, as in many states, zoning authority has been delegated or passed to local government. Right? We talked about that for limitation. This decision is often cited as the purpose of it, that local decisions are best made local. Right? So that's kind of the tradition there. Local zoning codes can also pass authority to the uses of property to owners by enabling by right uses or conditional or special exception uses. And this permission can and usually does vary by use and zoning. A by right use is allowed. There is no subjectivity or additional approval time added on. You meet the standards, you get it. Zoning code may allow, but this may be distinct between different kinds of uses for, like, zoning code may allow single family use in a certain zoning district by right, but the addition of an ADU to that same property could be through special exception. So those are different variations there. Time and subjectivity, when a use such as an ADU is seeking approval, if the ADU is permitted by right, then the approvals or the denials can be more certain. So again, this is these objective standards. I want to clarify that, this is not always cut and dry. I have some more qualifications before I get to the next section, but it varies significantly by zoning ordinance. And you really need to talk to individual jurisdictions to flesh out all the details. Additional time is not usually needed to take the ADU. Additional time is needed to take the ADU through a special exception process, right? So that's that uncertainty about time. It adds that time uncertainty, and it will usually contain a menu of topic areas or criteria. We'll get an example later that are evaluated against that use via ADU or any other use. So that'd be a special exception. For a permitted by right use, property owner can reasonably assume that their use can be constructed, provided the structure complies with lot, setback, and height standards, other standards you'll find in zoning ordinances. But if it's by special exception, it typically has to go in front of a board of appeals or a planning commission. And usually that criteria that they consider the special exception use against is subjective. This means that two similarly situated projects for the exact same project could receive very different determinations because of the standards or criteria that they're measured up against. Euclidean zoning, which has been brought up a couple times today, since the 50s, and even going back before that, Euclidean or use-based zoning has been the predominant form, right? Euclidean zoning usually works, and Adam, if I say anything wrong, please correct me, all right? I told you you should feel free to do that, all right? Euclidean zoning works in large part to separate uses. That's the main thing, rather than integrating uses, right? We want to keep these uses separate. You all have probably heard of and maybe familiar with form-based codes that are becoming more and more popular, even if not fully implemented in Maryland. And these focus on building form and lot standards rather than the uses themselves. They're oftentimes hybrid, where form-based concepts are integrated into a more Euclidean structured zoning code. Many ADU codes contain form-based graphics or the visuals to help define how the ADU is placed on a property.
More about what form-based is.
Form-based would be more just Euclidean zoning tends to focus really on just what the use of the property is.
Right.
May have some design standards, lot setback, whereas form is really more focused on the actual form of the structure.
Not what's in it.
They tend to be more hybrid. It's not usually going to be completely open, like you're going to put like oil refinery in a single family home or anything like that. But they tend to be more focused on form, design, mass than they are on just the use themselves. But most of them are going to be some hybrid form.
It's less prescriptive.
Yeah, when it comes to use, yeah.
And you're very, like, you could only do this here, this size, this type, very, very prescriptive, whereas form is allowing you to
So you could
be.
have a mixed business residential in the same.
It allows you to sort of have a little bit more, I think, in touch with the reality of the markets and changes to sort of, allow for some more flexibility. But if the form, if, the height and the density is fitting and in context,
Yeah.
that can work.
Okay.
So it really is a whole new approach to zoning that has been adopted by some areas to move away from the Euclidean, which is just very separate, like residential here, industrial here, for good reason at one point in time, maybe not so much anymore. Retail here, everything's in very separate locations, which also prompted more cars and less, a whole lot of issues came out of that also, in trying to fix some solutions. So we won't do a whole zoning.
Is there much
lecture.
of that done in Maryland now,
Which one?
form-based?
I don't have a good metric on how much of it. I don't know. Does anyone?
Get this question a lot.
Mayor Washington.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Senator Washington.
Thank you. And first time I've heard of form-based zoning, so I appreciate that. So in this context, are some forms more desirable or some forms, are some forms considered desirable and other forms considered nuisances or not desirable or undesirable?
Could be. It's a context issue as much as anything, but Amy has her, want to jump in and.
Well, so in Queen Anne's County, we have a form of form-based zoning in one of our growth area, some of our growth areas. We allow for different types of mixed-use development that is vertical, horizontal, and incentivizes with bonus density provisions. So what that means is we do have a means of allowing for mixed-use development as long as some of the minimum Euclidean style zoning types, zoning requirements are met. So there are ways that form-based is already being implemented, and it's something that as zoning codes are updated, I think that we'll be shifting more in that direction, because what we do have right now is, even with the leap that the county took years ago to try to integrate more form-based zoning, we're still not capturing the ever-changing markets, and especially since COVID and the change in retail, because a lot of mixed-use development has a retail component at its core and allows for residential uses and accessory uses on a percentage-based basis. So this is something that this exercise, I think, is going to be valuable.
And we can send you some links that if you want to learn more about these different types of zoning, because I think right now we're going to be looking most predominantly at Euclidean. And is it by right that it's already allowed, or is it only allowed if you go through a special approval process kind of thing? It's going to be most example.
And that's what I was trying to understand. By right can be limited by what the local government determines as undesirable or right. So that's why I just wondered if that I just wanted to raise that as a question, and is that are there
right
that are said it can't look like this, it can't be placed in this type of, that's what I.
Well, to James' earlier example, sure, you can do it by right, but you have to provide 2 off-street parking spaces. Well,
Right.
thanks, but no thanks, right? But Jennifer, you wanted to jump in here too.
Yeah, I just wanted the question of, is it throughout Maryland? I know there are several municipalities throughout Maryland that are, as you say, kind of looking and asking for assistance in developing form-based zoning. But where I've seen it kind of most prevalent, it's not truly form-based zoning, but it's overlay districts, and it's the special districts and overlay zoning So a property would have within the Euclidean zoning, it would have a specific use, but then there's an overlay district on top of it. So it's not quite form-based, but it provides the flexibility for, and a lot of it was in response for mixed-use development, transit-oriented development, those types of services. So as I think it was mentioned best of, there is no cut and dry answer to any of this. It's a lot of gray in all of this.
Council.
Questions?
Paul
Yep.
has hand up. He's joined virtually, but we'll get back to you. Councilmember Paul? You're muted.
Sorry, I just was unmuting myself. So I think one of the inherent tensions between by right and special exception is, you know, like in my neighborhood, I have 20 houses, and let's say I had 4 houses in that 20 unit area wanted to do, you know, ADUs. I might not be overly concerned about parking. I might not be overly concerned about different other, you know, capacity issues, water, sewer, otherwise. But if I made it by right and all 20 of those did an ADU, then I'm gonna have to be a lot more concerned about all those kind of capacity related issues. So it's really hard because I will tell you as a local elected official, you know, I would have to think long and hard about the pros and cons of being by right versus special exception and what kind of boundaries I would put on that. Because again, it's a bandwidth, you know, capacity issue of, you know, do I have enough parking? Do I have enough water and sewer capacity to be able to serve those additional dwelling units? So I'm not really, you know, stating any kind of answer. I'm just kind of giving a sense of like, it's a really hard issue to kind of figure out, you know, as a municipality or a governmental entity, like what makes sense being by right versus special exception.
Right, and I thank you for that perspective, and I think the other one that's not really here, it's related to form-based, which is performance-based. And I think it gets to a little bit of what you were talking about, Councilman, because a lot of times performance-based can just simply set some of those limits. You know, sometimes it's done through traffic studies or a variety of other metrics that really determine how is this performing, you know, to continue to address certain qualities or values or specifics that people care about. So there is that other direction that zoning is going in now also. But I think we had another hand up. Was it Amy or Jennifer? Amy.
And
we'll move on.
So we've gone kind of broad and are talking a lot about the different styles of regulating, but I want to kind of bring us back to the focus that this is an accessory use. So we are talking about broader themes, but we still, in the context of this analysis, this is an accessory use to a primary principal use. And in a lot of ways, we keep slipping into conversations about multifamily dwellings when actually we're talking about a use that is accessory to a primary use. So I just think, and I keep having to refocus my brain because I keep thinking along the lines of, well, we're having an affordable housing conversation, which we are, but this is very specific.
Yeah.
And the issues that have been raised about equity and about being able to provide services and parking and adequate public facilities, that those adequate public facilities are based on a use that is less than a principal use.
Correct.
So it's just kind of refocusing.
Thank you. Thank you for that reminder and focus because yeah, some of this won't even be relevant. It's sort of just, I think, trying to acquaint folks with how the regulations work, but really, really good point for keeping us focused and the fact that it is accessory more than likely in an existing residential zoned area in most cases.
Senator Mary Washington.
Yep, Senator.
I just have a question of the meaning of performance. Would that be property values? Would that be?
No.
Okay, so performance is?
Performance metrics can relate to more specific to things like traffic, parking, water and sewer. I mean, it's very clear things of carrying capacity type issues or particular metrics that are going to ensure that the context, is not grossly disrupted. And you could say in one case, well, we can envision 20 accessory dwelling units in a 5-block area, but that doesn't really tell you as much as you might learn toward knowing about the size of those units or the number of bedrooms in those units and how are those performing in a situation which may already have serious sewer or traffic issues. And so it's more related to what are those other metrics that really determine the functionality, the quality of life that people are trying to retain there. And so it's another way of, or building in to any type of approach to an ADU type policy or regulation.
And I think building on what the councilman said, state electeds are also concerned with what people are concerned with. And so he made a distinction between, if there's the model, it really isn't, it's just the garage that's already attached. It's all part of the same block. It's not going to become its own versus, some other models where people were interested in building or adding on to. But there is a concern locally about, what putting in lots of things, increasing the housing supply potentially suppresses property values, right? So I think that's the tension here and why the broader conversation is relevant. Again, narrowed about the impact of this would be a zoning decision some way by right or whatever. And that decision has an impact on one of the things that zoning, that single family zoning has been used to do is to to maintain property values. And so anything that is a potential threat or a change in that needs to be considered. So I just
I think
where that fits, where us getting information, because people are going to ask, I think, hey, is this going to decrease my property values if X, Y, and Z happens?
And we do have the housing market, I think, component of our work that'll get into more the market side versus the regulatory side. Today, we're focusing on our first particular topic, which is around, the zoning specific mechanisms or tools for ADUs. And as you look at that research sheet, that's the one we're specifically trying to focus on today.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
I just want to say that in looking at understanding those, I think it would be useful for me, and I think the councilman as well, is that if you see where they've been implemented, if there are impacts, on property values.
On the market, okay.
That's a very specific.
Right.
concern.
Yeah, and that's a different type of question. So well noted. I want to get to Mandy, who's had her hand up also for a while. Mandy?
Yes, I don't know if it would be possible to get this information, but even when zoning would allow ADUs and existing residential units, there's a lot of homeowners associations that won't. Is there a way we could maybe quantify that data? I don't know if that's possible.
Good point. Are we delving into that at all?
Text me something about tech. Can you ask the question?
So homeowners associations, which sort of have their own set of rules, regulations, guidelines. Are we delving into that area or do we know?
That if you look at actually it's on the, if you look at the state legislation inventory I sent you.
Okay.
It tells you which states have created legislation that overrides local. I don't know how that legally works in Maryland. I'm not looking at Adam. about how overrides could work. I don't know if any kind of authority like that could be delegated locally, where local governments could override covenants. I don't know. But that is something that's addressed in the state legislation. It'd be something that will be more of a topic later on.
So I think as far as this list go, though, CCR's covenants, conditions, and regulations that usually go with particular subdivisions, homeowners associations are something that we should at least add to the list and learn what we can.
And I think we should also add for legal counsel to not look, what is it going to be? What's going to happen with the current HOAs, right? Because you have current bylaws,
Right.
people have bought in. So is this going to be going forward, effective date, any, construction? And it should be, we need to think about not just construction that's occurring, but like, because the HOAs are usually kind of started to create it once there's one or two homes that are now occupied. So we've got to think about if there is a recommendation that there's an override, where does that fall in the actual HOA bylaws,
Current
filing,
conditions,
currents, all of that?
Yep, gotcha. Got it. Good. So, yeah, I think we need to move along, just watching our time. So let's get to the next piece here.
And difficulty management. All right. So this last little part is, I'm going to run through, I've already shared prior to the last meeting, I shared the Maryland inventory of ADU ordinances and the state inventory of ADU legislation. So I showed you earlier about the different topics by different meetings. We're gonna be doing the same thing at every meeting, at least up to a point, but we're gonna look at these specific topic areas and see what the Maryland inventory says about them, pull out examples from it, and then see what other state legislation says about those topic areas. So that's what we're doing here. Today, though, we're focusing on what both of them tell us about use allowances and approval processes are considered in light of by right or special exception, which we just hopefully explained, but we're always happy to take more questions. But I need to be clear before I begin. I highlighted this. Sure, we talked about this yesterday with my colleagues. I'm going to make sure I express it that every jurisdiction writes a zoning ordinance in unique and context-specific ways. The examples that follow are summarized really to highlight processes and distinct options that a local government could consider, or that you all could consider when you're developing recommendations. They're not intended to fully encapsulate all the specific details and the nuances of the respective ordinances, right? So the ones I show you, if you come back with really, really specific questions about how exactly that works, probably not going to be able to answer that. The only people that could really answer it would be the local government. Right, so these are really supposed to highlight options, processes. Also, my distinction in the slides that follows between by right and by right with conditions is really only for illustrative purposes. So you'll see I have one that's talking about by right and one that's by right with conditions. We talk about this kind of stuff all the time internally, but I don't think the nuance, all the minutiae that are relevant to our discussion. Conditions could also be described as standards that any use may have to meet in some form. The most important distinction is between those uses that are permitted through an administrative, or the other term is ministerial process, that would be by right, and those that are approved through a legislative or discretionary process, which we're going to, in these examples, we're going to refer to as special exception. Right. So the biggest thing that for you all to know is that all these are very specific to local jurisdiction, and they're all written differently based on their unique context. Okay, so let's look at Maryland.
So, yeah, before you start, Joe, first of all, I want to point to the fact, and thank you, the previous slide does have a hot link to the link of the full inventory. So know that that's all there. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Joe, and maybe let Joe literally go through these, because I don't want to lose out on time to discuss some of the outcomes. And so the next few slides are just examples of how different folks are doing these things. And I want to ask that we maybe hold questions while we get through the examples. It's something to just give you food for thought. And then we'll have these other state legislative analysis. And so I'm just going to really watch our time, because it's very, very important today that we get to a point where we have adequate discussion around the by right conditions and special exceptions component that we're trying to focus on today. So
Would this be a good time to take a break before we
yes,
get into that discussion?
it could be. If people feel that we need a 5 minute, I think that time is upon us 10:38.
Questions right down the hall.
5 minute. Thank you. Stretch break. Everyone that's online, we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'm showing 10:38 and we will reconvene by 10:45 promptly and start moving through these examples. So are we muted? Essentially walking you through these examples. Whoops, are we walking you through these examples? I'm going to ask everyone to hold questions. If there's something burning that's a clarifying question, raise your hand or just note which slide it is and we'll go back to it. But I feel like if we can get through the examples in the next 20 minutes, then that's going to give us, a solid, do the math, 40 minutes for discussion. We have public comment at 11:30. So actually that gives us 25 minutes for discussion so that we can stay committed to our public comment at 11:30. And then we'll still have some time at the end if we need to sort of circle back before we adjourn. So that's the game plan. And Joe, go, I'm timing you.
So this is merely summarized, looking at the inventory specific to by right and use allowance, special exception. I want to clarify there are many, many variations between jurisdictions. This categorization, again, is simply for illustrative and discussion purposes. Oftentimes, the variations are so significant that a true categorization is not possible, but I did find some trends to describe here, right? So ADUs tend a trend to be permitted by right in those that permit it in medium density residential districts, town center districts, agricultural districts. That's what we see in our inventory. ADUs tend to be permitted by special exception in historic districts or those with design restrictions and or neighborhood preservation purposes. Critical areas are the resource conservation districts and lower density or suburban residential districts. And then I found no demonstrable tendency. It was just all over the place when it comes to commercial and business districts, high density residential and mixed use districts, and village conservation districts. I'll give you a couple quick examples. One municipality permits ADUs by right in the town residential and town center districts, which include higher density core areas of the municipality. It permits ADUs by special exception in suburban residential districts, which are those areas with moderate density that should be protected from incompatible non-residential uses as they describe them. The second example, the jurisdiction permits by right, ADUs by right subject to objective standards in single family districts for varying densities in residence neighborhood revitalization districts, but special exception in residence neighborhood conservation districts. All right, so sometimes they're very, very small distinctions there, but we're going to look at some examples here. The first one is going to be Aberdeen. And I'm not going to read all these slides to you, but they follow the standard format here. It gives you the definition of, they use all these examples, I think, use accessory apartment as opposed to accessory dwelling unit. You're going to find all sorts of different names. Aberdeen defines ADUs as a type of dwelling, not as a type of accessory structure. Those are regulated separately. The districts where they're permitted by right are in the ones here. The highlight means the one we're going to look at more closely next. And as I talked earlier about, the key distinction is the approval process. They are approved ministerially or administratively by the zoning administrator. All right, so here it's R2, you have a medium density residential district. There's the purpose of it. Yeah, I'm not going to read it to you, but you have it all. They do specifically have this note that an accessory apartment shall not exceed 50% of the above grade living area of the principal use or structure. All right, that's would be the single family probably unit on the property. And then I just want to show you, here's their process criteria for that ministerial approval. You have to submit a permit application, plot plan, location survey, construction drawings, and then they're reviewed for compliance with the development code, including backyard height, parking, and other requirements. This goes back to that earlier slide where we're talking about those objective standards. So you have to meet these objective standards, and it's reviewed by the zoning administrator, staff, and it's approved administratively, ministerially. And then I just put down here that it does go through a plans review process, and in this situation, they if applicable, will forward some of the permitting analysis, electrical, plumbing, et cetera, to the county. So that's one example. I'm going to show you the process. I want to look at one by right with conditions. So it's key to note that this is still by right. But I would really, instead of focusing on the process as much, which is what I was doing with Aberdeen, I want to focus on the conditions. And this is New Market. They don't actually specifically define what an accessory apartment is, but it is categorized as an accessory use rather than a residential use. So there's a distinction between Aberdeen, which counts with ADU or accessory apartments as residential use. New Market categorizes it as an accessory use. And this one specifically, they say this over and over again, accessory apartments are only permitted as internal ADUs, a conversion, or as part of an addition to a single family home. So no detached ADUs. Remember, SB 382 included detached ADU as part of the definition. And then by right subject to conditions in the R1 and RM. This is a residential merchant district. I think that's what it's called. But again, they specifically say only in a dwelling unit. That's what we're going to look at next. Again, approved ministerially by the zoning administrator. There's the purpose at the top. Again, they focus on within residential structure in their use table. They call it RM and DU, which means residential merchant in dwelling unit. So within a single family dwelling unit, they say it again, is within, like these are the objective standards, right, that it has to meet to be approved ministerially. They have a different size threshold than Aberdeen. That's lesser of 33% or no more or more than 800 square feet, whichever is less. You have to have an entrance to the accessory dwelling unit from outside. It shall not be on the front wall of the principal structure. So you're not adding another door in the front. No home occupations. And then I wanted to highlight, because we talk about parking so much, this one has a minimum total of 4 off-street parking spaces provided for the principal dwelling and the accessory dwelling unit. That's a lot of parking spaces provided, right? But again, you see how these are objective standards. If you meet these, I mean, of course, there's always some gray area between what is truly objective and what's not, but these are designed to be objective standards. And you'll see a strong distinction when we look at the special exception example. So this one's Wacomico by special exception. It's an accessory apartment again, and they also define as a type of accessory use. They have special exception by the Board of Appeals in most of their districts and special exception by the Planning Commission in the C1 or some commercial district. This approval is distinctly different. It's by the Board of Appeals for those first ones, and then the Planning Commission after a public hearing. So they specifically require a public hearing. So it's that discretionary or legislative process. We're looking at the R8 district, and they talk about criteria for approval. Preponderance of evidence produced at a public hearing. And you'll see how subjective these are compared to what we saw, right? Consistent with the comprehensive plan, it cannot adversely affect the health, safety, and general welfare, right? That can mean a lot of things. It has to be compatible with and will not be detrimental to the surrounding neighborhood, minimize adverse, they use adverse a lot on adjacent properties, not adversely affect the transportation network, and not adversely affect the environmental, archaeological, historic aspects. Right, so the first two, they have this clear-cut process. We talked earlier about repeatable, understandable, the applicant will have a better idea of their timeline, clear objectives, whereas this one, where it has more ability to really have oversight of that impact on the neighborhood, it has a lot more subjective standards. All right, so now I'm going to look at how other state legislation has dealt with this. And just like with the other one, where you can access the table that we put together through this link right here. All right, so I categorize these into the best term I could come up with: lower degree state preemption and higher state preemption. Others may disagree with how I categorize them, but Adam at least told me that is not a legal term that I'm using there. So I shouldn't be too worried about the lawyers coming to get me. So I made up a term for this purpose. There's a link to the actual the legislation in here. This would be Oregon, HB 2001 from 2019. This one, it specifies what kind of communities have to require these ADU requirements. So it has to be of a certain size within an urban growth boundary, and it can be subject to reasonable local regulations relating to siting and design. But it's key to note here that they later on define reasonable local regulations preclude owner occupancy and additional off-street parking requirements. So you can't require owner occupancy, you can't require off-street parking, but it does not preclude that you can only approve these by special exception. So that's what their legislation says. The next lower degree one, this one's hard to see, but it's New Hampshire. This is from 2016, SB 146. They specifically say that a municipality shall allow accessory dwelling units, but then they also say as a matter of right or by either conditional use permit or by special exception. So they give that allowance. You have to allow them, but you can do it by conditional or by right or special exception. And then this one says, basically, the next part says, if your zoning ordinance doesn't contain provisions for accessory dwelling units, then the state's basically going to say that you have to allow one by right, one unit by right. So it's essentially saying here, if you want to have more flexibility, get your zoning ordinance in place to allow ADUs and put the special exception requirements in there. If you don't create a zoning ordinance for ADUs, the state's gonna override you and say you have to allow one by right, one unit by right. So you often see that in state legislation, like you have to do this, and if you do it, you have more flexibility. If you don't do it, there's gonna be more preemption. That's what New Hampshire's done. All right, let's go look at higher degrees. Sorry, there's a lot of wording on these slides, but I'm gonna try to just put up all this stuff. This is California. This one doesn't have a specific bill. Again, always for doing a lot of this work to help us out. There's multiple bills over multiple years. So I just have a link to the law. This specifically says that a permit application at the local level has to be approved ministerially. There's that word again, without discretionary review or hearing. It has to be either approved or denied, processed within 60 days. So they give a time frame. So that's a lot more preemption. And it's if there is an existing family or multifamily dwelling on the plot. Again, it reiterates only ministerial provisions for the approval of accessory dwelling units and shall not include any discretionary processes, requirements, or provisions. So, except as otherwise provided in the subdivision. But anyway, so that's specifically, I mean, they really hit over and over again that you cannot have a special exception approval process for ADUs. And that you have to do it within a certain time. And then another one is Montana. This is the most recent one, SB 528, 2023. Minimum of one by right. And then they also give some timeframes that you haven't adopted something pursuant, this is still in the future now because it's January 1st of 2024, that you shall review a permanent accessory dwelling units in accordance with the requirements of this section that goes back to minimum of one accessory dwelling unit by right. And that if any regulations in effect after that date that are not, California also said, that do not align with these requirements are void. The state is voiding, making your ADU ordinance null and void if you do not meet these requirements. And then they specifically give a definition in their legislation about what by right means. Without a public hearing, without a variance, conditional use permit, and other discretionary zoning actions. So again, I quickly want to point out public comments on this. So, I looked through all the comments we received. This was last week, specific to this topic. But I did think it's fair to point out those that are related to this topic. Some of them are more indirectly related. So good land use protects the character of established neighborhoods. There's talking about that protection aspect, right? Special exceptions allow for that protection. And the next one says, please allow as few barriers as possible to construction. As we already have seen, special exceptions have that slower process, less repeatable and understandable. So that this person, I'm guessing, would consider special exception a barrier. The next one says less restrictive and more flexibility. So again, we want least restrictions. The next one talks about Baltimore and how Baltimore is still recovering from the time when the conversion of single family to multifamily housing was a matter of right. This is on the other side. They're talking about how Baltimore has particularly struggled by allowing these conversions by right. And then the next one says most innovative and permissive ADU recommendation is what they're asking of the task force. And then they talk about California. We showed California here. It talks about how state laws overriding local restrictions can lead to a building code. So we have public comments on both sides of this topic about special exception, use allowances, and by right. So again, I know that was a quick run through. I'm happy to go back to any during part of the discussion, But I wanted to lay out the options and show you different things that can be done locally, different things that have been done at the state level, and what public comments say. So let's get back to the main objectives of today's meeting. And these are the discussion questions. There are preliminary legislative recommendations related to this topic today. And what are some best practices related to today's topic the task force could include? Because remember, those are the two main deliverables: list of policy recommendations and legislative recommendations, and lists of best practices. And then if you have any additional research that we should do on this.
Wow, 15 minutes. You did great. Thank you. Hopefully everyone captured those examples, which were wonderful. Thanks to you and the staff for pulling this together. So I think as a way of organizing our next 30 minutes, what I'd like to do is, maybe step back and go back to the first one and just kind of, what do you like? What don't you like? And we'll just try to kind of capture that.
Maryland example?
Yeah. And I'll try to allow, just a quick round robin if needed. I want to make sure we hear from various people, not just always the same people. So, but if we want to just real quickly, and we'll monitor hands up. Let's just start with, and just real quick brainstorm. What do you like about this one? If anything, you don't have to like anything. And if you're on the chat, feel free. Yeah.
This is the first time it actually kind of came to my mind how specific they are in making sure that the dwelling includes dwelling capabilities, whereas one of the other ones included, you just have to have a bathroom and a sink, but this one says specifically you must also have cooking. I think that's something we don't address as much, but making sure that if somebody is building this dwelling unit and expecting somebody to live in it, it needs to be habitable.
So really being even more precise on what do we mean by a dwelling unit?
And the dwelling, so I thought these different examples were so interesting in dwelling, apartment, or accessory use.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, getting to those definitions is really helpful.
So you like the precision of really specifying that someone can live here.
Yeah, I think so. I think if we're gonna, because then we head down that kind of tenement route.
Other things that people saw in this one that really jumped out at them or that they liked? Yeah, Theo.
I mean, the flexibility of it, I think, is very useful. When we're talking about some of the other ones, either being too prescriptive in terms of, for example, requiring 4 parking spots, that can be a huge barrier, or giving a sense of uncertainty that goes along with having some type of discretionary period. I think if I were looking at the regulations for Wycomico, I might not even want to go down the route of trying to go before the board, knowing how, it really is a coin flip in terms of who shows up and who opposes me. Whereas this, they are restricting it to only certain districts. B is business, correct, Joe and Secretary?
B is.
He's usually going to be business.
Different codes do it differently. I would use C, but B, I presume, would be business in this case.
So I'm a little surprised by that. But nevertheless, I think this is a good balance between, not allowing it everywhere, but, still allowing for a lot of flexibility.
Okay, so the flexibility there, and it sounds like what to expect on this. You're not caught up in some process that it's got a lot of clarity there. Any other, and I'll just move to the negative side. Any other just general?
Positive that they defined it as either within or outside, external or internal.
Yes.
And I think some of the others limited it to not having the external.
So you like the fact that either you could do either. Okay, great. Okay, any thoughts? And I'm trying to look for hands, so please flag me.
That it's considered a dwelling. I think I guess to the earlier question about defining what this is. So I like that part of it.
Being clear that it's, I think that's what Deborah was pointing out. Exactly. Good. Anything here that concerns anybody about how this is written?
It doesn't concern me, but I think it's just something we need to think about. This is going to be primarily dependent upon lot size. So the impact of where this really could occur may not be able to happen in a more urban, dense population versus a more suburban or rural. So I think if we're looking at this, I think it's a great definition. I think it gives clarity, but I think the impact of where this really could be goes to the districts, and I'm curious to know what the size lots for those permitted districts. So I'm just
Okay.
it's not a.
So that might relate to the question of further information, need to know more, right? In terms of, are there minimum lot sizes? Are there, how does this kind of fit in? Because they do reference the 50%. Did I get the right one? Where was that? 50%, not exceed 50%. Okay, we're gonna go ahead. One more on this one.
So it's more of an overarching, and I was writing notes as I heard things, so I don't remember exactly which goes where. I did triple underline dwelling, so I was glad you said that.
Great.
But it's actually from an earlier slide, just as you were defining the by right and special exception. One of the things I really liked in that, and it goes to the comment about districts, is special exception being historic districts and conservation districts. And I did write down, we need to define exactly what a conservation district is, but having that almost as an overlay above everything else of first and foremost, a historic district should be a special exception no matter what, a conservation area, whether it's environmental or, and again, this is where we would need to do more research and define what is that conservation area of having, again, that being an overarching exception, special exception, and then getting into the by right. So that almost becomes, if you're doing, in my mind, I look at it all as a flow chart and a flow diagram. You put it in and it's like, okay, yes, no.
In this section, yeah, I like the way you're graphically thinking about that too. That's great. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to keep us moving. Okay. Any initial, and please, others that are just listening in, it's okay to just listen in. But I want to make sure everybody gets a chance here, but we will do the closing round also. So everybody will get a chance to sort of say where they're at. But on this one, anything that particularly stands out that anyone likes about this one?
All right, so this was 2 slides. This one really focuses on conditions. So I'm happy to stay on whatever slide you like.
Which is most useful for folks, yeah.
Skip the Aberdeen one on purpose or no?
No, we just did.
We just did everything. I don't have on this slide very often. There's 2 slides per jurisdiction.
Oh, yeah. There's like an overview and then a detail. And so, but I wanted to move on to Newmarket if we could. And just see if there's anything here and just kind of scan that. And then maybe Joe, go ahead and jump to that detail. Anything about this one that stands out that people liked? And I think there's a lot of detail here. Is any of that particularly jump out as something that, yeah, I kind of like what they're doing here? Anything that people look at this and say, yeah, this gives me. Yeah.
angst.
What would that be? Let's start with Chelsea.
So it doesn't create independent housing opportunities for people with disabilities. So, I mean, the last one I liked because it made it clear that like, this is a dwelling unit, that non-congregate facility, it's where the person can independently live. This only really allows it where like, it has to be built in an existing building,
which
not independent living, or like as a little add-on to another building. So that can be a problem for sure.
Right, that's great, Chelsea. And it also points to the within a building versus separate, you have more opportunity for those issues of access and disability.
Yeah.
You do have that separate situation. Priscilla?
Size, because this one limits it to 33% or 800 feet,
Sorry.
which I really think is kind of the way to go. I mean, I like that as a positive because.
You see that as a positive.
If you have a 4,000 square foot house and you give 50%, that's a 2,000 square foot dwelling. That's a separate house. So, I mean, I think there has to be, I don't know what the magic number is, but I think there has to be a reasonable size maximum expectation.
And that may get back to lot size again, too. And so maybe.
It's an excessive, if it's an external building, but if it's internal.
Yeah, I think I know I'm only supposed to be facilitating, but I'm just going to make point to the fact that most of these are based on floor area, which in some respects as a metric is interesting that some of them are using that versus lot area. And so it's just an observation, but
This is only in the house. They're not adding it. They don't have any kind of outside building.
yeah, okay, within, okay,
I would
right.
assume the lot area would be covered when you actually do the zoning analysis and make sure that if you're adding this.
Got your
extra
setbacks
structure,
and everything.
You've got the setbacks, you've got your lot coverage, you're meeting the floor area,
Mhm.
heights, whatever they are. And I would assume that that would also be a local decision, not part of this.
Good point, Deborah, thank you. Other thoughts on this one? Anything that you particularly like about it? Anything that gives you concern?
I agree with Priscilla, sorry, just to
Yep.
piggyback on that. I like that this limits it to 800 or 33% and saying it's not just contingent on the, not that those are the exact right numbers, but it's not just contingent. I mean, what if you have a 33,000 square foot house?
Right.
Which is not implausible, I'll tell you.
Okay,
I've never had one of those clients.
great. Others, anyone online that we're
Did
missing?
anybody comment on the 4 parking spaces?
I think
that's unrealistic.
Yeah, the whole
Yeah.
criteria is unrealistic.
The parking space is just over the top. Yeah,
I mean, the parking definitely is a consideration and it needs to be, and the off-street versus on-street. I mean, that is a very critical component for character and context. But a blanket statement is a very challenging element, and I don't have an answer for it, but I know we'll talk about all of that in, I think, the February meeting.
Mhm.
So I think that's a time to vet that through even more.
Mhm.
But it definitely needs some further consideration, not just a blanket statement.
So as a condition.
It's, yes,
Mhm.
I believe it should be more related as it comes back to lot size, context, what type of zoning it's in. And I think
Okay.
it's much more so than just assuming, 2 to 3 spaces per element.
Yep. Other thoughts on this one? New market.
I just have a question. So back again, sorry, to the square footage thing. Are there typically zoning limitations on how small of a house you could build? And I tried to research this actually for a project a while ago, and some areas, not necessarily in Maryland, did have limitations on how small you could go, and it wasn't based on codes. I didn't know if that was a zoning thing or not. Go ahead, Ann.
I've seen it as a manifestation of building code standards and
just
not
building
zoning.
Okay.
I've only seen it on zoning in like special plan district where there's actually an incentive to have more lot coverage.
Uh-huh.
And so that you actually want to maximize density by in terms of your floor to area ratio and how much coverage you want of the lot. So I have seen it done in
Or a
that
tax,
respect.
an SDAT thing or something, like it's a tax.
I don't think it's a tax. It's more of a density and sort of the look and feel of like a special plan district and the density of it, and to ensure that there's not a little tiny building on a big lot and then you're wasting that land and not optimizing the density. I've seen it on the reverse. And so in which case it would relate to what you're saying is that it would limit. In that case, I've seen in special plan districts and wouldn't allow tiny areas because they wouldn't necessarily meet the lot coverage requirements. So I've only kind of a sidebar, but when I see that.
I guess I wonder, because I do see people trending towards smaller houses. And if they are, then all of a sudden that 33% or 800 square feet is a different equation.
Because we talked about that at the last meeting with the tiny houses. All right, I have one more thing I don't like on this one.
Okay.
I don't have any idea why they have this thing about if you've rented guest rooms in your house, then you can't have an accessory dwelling unit. I mean, it just seems like they're just looking at every single possible way to not allow these things.
I think they're probably trying to address the short-term rental. If people had an Airbnb, I think maybe they want to limit the conversion of those, and maybe that's what I think that should probably be a consideration, that people who are currently using the Airbnb may want to transition to ADU.
I was also noting that when it talks about the district purpose, which I think is very telling for some of these requirements too. that it is about the historic character areas within the town. So I could definitely see that that's preempting a lot of
It
what
is.
we're seeing
Good
here.
point. Okay, great. Well, let's,
hate to-
go ahead.
Yeah,
One
I hate
more?
to jump in. Miss Washington took my thunder. It's the ADU. I mean, it's the Airbnb piece. A lot of jurisdictions are just against Airbnbs, and if you currently have one, they don't want you to just flip it. So she's correct. I'm in total agreement with her about that.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, and we're gonna move to the next one, just so we get through all of these and just get your initial impressions.
And I apologize, my comment was on the next one.
Is on Wincom and Co. I'm gonna look online first and see if anyone online has a hand or comment on Wincom and Co. Example. Feel free to jump in later. Just wanted to give you all that chance. Folks in the room, any initial impressions, pro, con, something I like, something I don't like?
You like and again, it goes to that Airbnb comment, but the statement of how many accessory dwelling units on a parcel. And again, whether it's looking at this is talking about the one, so you're not renting your room, kind of limiting that. But if there's a way as we're coming up with the recommendations, we have the definition of an accessory dwelling unit. And that being a very prescribed and defined element and limiting the number on a parcel, not just leaving that up as open.
Yeah, on this one, they do refer to the lot size here too. So other observations on this one? What do you like, don't like? Theo?
I mean, I feel like this is kind of the inverse of the comment I made in Aberdeen, that by having everything be so subjective, you really have no clarity as to whether or not it's going to be approved. I mean, obviously, Board of Zoning Appeals or Planning Commissions. So, again, I don't know if I, as an owner, would see this, would be even interested in going down that route.
I think my eyes would glaze over pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think what goes to that is, I'm gonna be honest, who knows what the comprehensive plan is?
Yeah.
I mean, and the individuals in the industry do, but a homeowner's gonna have no clue what the comprehensive plan is.
And it's very possible, since comp plans only have to be updated every 10 years. That the last time it was done was before this even became an issue or thought about, so.
And it seems like it's creating so much extra work on the policy side to have to do everything through special exception.
Which then also impacts the length of time. Some special exceptions can take 18 months. And sometimes even 2 years, depending how complicated, or if there's community input. And so, when you're looking at this, I think would be prohibitive from where we're really trying to accomplish for that individual homeowner. Take 2 years to do this. You're doing it for a family member because they need independent living. May not even,
It's too long.
it may be too late for them.
You
to
might as well get
actually
on the
utilize.
waiting list for the independent facility, which is another several years, right? So, one last on Wacomico, yes.
I have one negative. This is something when Joe was doing some of the other stuff, he said it was the term objective standards. I'd love to know what an objective standard is. And I look at this one and it says the proposed use will not adversely affect the health, safety and general welfare. I'd love to hear the definition of that. I mean, how do you define how it's going to impact the welfare of the workers in the area, the residents? So anything like that, I think, is the kind of stuff that does lead to the racial inequities in housing. Cannot have that.
Okay. Anything, so did we hear anything on this one that people liked?
No.
I just to be fair, I want to make sure I didn't skim over anything that someone might have liked in this
I
one.
think some folks said they liked, I know we were talking about with the last one, the short-term rental component, which is 3 here.
Okay. Okay.
So is what that's saying,
It doesn't spell it out.
is it saying that you cannot use this as a rental, or you can't put this on a lot when there is already a rental? That's, I don't, I can't.
I just don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I guess that doesn't.
It says I would have to see how it defines renting of guest rooms before I know.
Yeah, it's fairly confusing. Yeah.
I'm also wondering how they would know that necessarily. How is that enforceable or how is that common knowledge? I don't know.
I mean, in code enforcement, we would just go to Airbnb.
Right.
Look at the
You'd have to check it out there.
So one last thought on this one is, I do find it interesting, all parking is appropriately located as specified by the Board of Appeals. That's interesting because they did not mandate a parking requirement. They left that to the zoning board of appeals, which I thought was interesting on this one.
An objective standard.
Yes, true. Okay, let's go to the next one, Joe, watching our time. Oregon, okay. We had one slide each on these state ones, is that, or was there two on
Yeah,
this?
one slide for each of the states.
Okay, so Oregon kind of went out there and did something interesting. Theo?
One of the things I really like about the Oregon model is I really feel like they thread the needle on the rural versus urban. So they make a distinction here within both in terms of the size of the population, but also they have like a special planning authority called the Metro Authority for Portland, I believe. Or maybe confusing it with Seattle. Anyway, there's a reference to the urban growth boundary that really they're saying, you know, within areas that we want to have high growth, we want to make ADUs as permissive as possible. But within jurisdictions that are more rural, we're not really going to meddle with them. And I think that's a really great way just to kind of thread the needle on, you know, giving some jurisdictions some local control, whereas really concentrating density in where it's needed most.
Interesting, good observation. Other thoughts on this one? How they went for this one?
Right, if no one else has a comment, I have one about the size or the number. You know, when I look at my county, there are areas that are zoned for 5-acre residential single-family homes. I mean, they are fields of grass that they're just sitting there. You talk about a housing shortage. If they could have more than one accessory dwelling unit, it would be fabulous. And they have plenty of room. So, you know, I like that they didn't limit it to just one if that was appropriate for the zoning or for the area.
Interesting.
Well, to be a bit of a devil's advocate on that, I also live in an area where there are 5 acres, single family, and that's a specific purpose for that area. It creates a certain character in that area, and that's a natural overlay rather than about the housing. So I don't know if I would always be inclined to say, since there's space, use it.
Well, I'm not saying they have to, but I'm saying, yeah.
But then they might if they can.
Yeah, well, but they'd have to, yeah, there would be a restriction.
Okay, I'm looking online. I don't see anything.
I also want to focus on like today's topic as well.
Right.
All of these, today's topic especially is always going to have these other things that are future topics as
Right.
well.
But this is
Remember
specific.
the thing about Oregon, while it does have these urban growth boundaries and size limitations, it specifically says you can still allow it by specs or special exception. You still have special exception approvals in your AD ordinances.
So, and to that point, before we move to the next one, I just want to add that the definition of reasonable local regulations precludes owner occupancy and additional off-street parking requirements, but not special exceptions. So I think it's interesting. They've said you can do this and use that reasonability, but you're not allowed to preclude owner occupied or create additional off-street parking. It's
saying that you are not allowed to include owner occupancy and additional off-street parking as part of your requirements.
Exactly.
But you can make the approval process specifically have to go to the special.
Yeah, but don't touch those items because those are the items that I think they're seeing are the ones that are the biggest barrier. So I think it's fascinating that they took those 2 points to say, you can't mess with that. You can do a lot, but those have to not be outrageous.
I'd be interested to see what the special exception requirements or criteria would be in such a jurisdiction, because if you look at the examples we have from Comico, you know, it's like adverse impact on the transportation network, adverse impact on the neighborhood. Like, but if you're not going to allow off-street parking requirements, you probably can't have that subjective criteria for adverse impacts on the transportation network, right? I don't see how you could, unless you're basing it just on the road and not the parking. I don't know. I just think I'd be interested to see what they actually look like.
Okay, let's move on to New York.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, sorry.
And again, as a reminder, this one allows it to use by right, conditional use permit, or by special exception. But if they don't create a zoning ordinance,
I really like that side of it. I even wrote that New Hampshire example, recommend for Maryland.
So if I had a dot exercise, your dots would all go on this one, right?
I like this one, but I think the problem is it's kind of kicking the ball. And then you're gonna kind of be where we kind of are now, where they're just in certain places, it's not allowed to some extent. So I feel like it's great, but are we really, what would really come out of it? Because it's like, you're gonna have to do something, and then they may do something. Is it really what we want? What we
They
don't
do
want?
like Webco, it's so restrictive that
Yeah.
it's not gonna happen anyways.
And so, and then you're in compliance with the second paragraph.
So to that point, this one would be interesting if they put a couple of those ads, like the owner and the parking thing.
Yes,
perhaps,
yes.
Right? Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and my thought on that was if it's set up of you cannot be more restrictive than what the state has, and if you don't come up with your own, then you follow the state.
Yeah, oh, that's an interesting.
That's having that as a component so that it does allow the framework of this, and the state having obviously the recommendations, but then the individual municipalities cannot be more restrictive without perhaps the special exemption or something of that
okay.
situation.
Interesting. Anybody online that I'm missing? Having hands up? We have a hand? No? Okay. Other thoughts in the room before we move to the next state of like, dislike, observe? Okay, let's move to the next state. California. We would expect the most far-reaching for California. They have probably the biggest housing crisis in the country right now, I think, perhaps. I can see why they would want to reach. I just to kick us off, the time limit is interesting here. Other thoughts? What do you see that you think is interesting, you like, you don't like? Theo?
I make a comment that is related to the topic, but slightly off topic, if that's okay.
What is it? You had 20 seconds.
Real quick, the impact of California's legislation has led to the creation of 24,000 ADUs. That sounds like a lot, but if you look at the number of units in California, which is 14.6 million, it equals to less than 0.15% of all units. So over the course of 10 years, you're going to see an increase in total units of 1.5%. So when we are talking about something this permissive, even in a state of severe housing crisis, people still don't actually, they want ADUs, but they don't, not that many people want ADUs. We're talking about less than 1% of people are building ADUs.
Going to pursue it.
I think that is such a good point.
It's a really good data point. I would say that's directly relevant.
Okay, well.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that data point again, because it does put it in perspective. The quantity, and it keeps in mind, this is enabling. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to run out and do it. So I think that's a good point to remember. Other comments on this one, things that people sort of jumping out here that you might like or dislike?
I would be interested to your, and I don't know how we would do this as a research point of if there is a way to ask the question of why not more? From somebody who has that knowledge in California. Of what this is fairly open, why not more? What are the barriers, and that bringing that back as a research topic, because we've talked many times about how are we removing barriers. To me, that the trend seems to be that there is still a barrier, even as open as this is. So what is that? Is it costs? Is it?
Right, is it privacy? Is it cost?
Right.
Is it just,
So I don't know.
No contractors out there.
Or like the people who have the capability don't have.
Can I give
But I
a
think
subjective
cost is a big
response to
one.
that, having lived in California for 29 years? The vast majority of communities in California are built on postage stamp sized lots. They're small houses, you have a lot of 12 and 1,800 square foot houses. So they don't have the space to add it, and they don't have basements, so they can't put a finished basement. I mean, there's so many prohibiting things that even if people wanted to, they wouldn't have room in their backyard, and they wouldn't have the ability other than converting a garage, which people have done historically, but I would speculate that that's one
A
of the
factor.
major obstacles.
Right. Okay, looking at time again, 'cause it's 11:30 and time for public comment. So we have one more comment. Amy.
Just gonna say, I think it's interesting, and I'd like to see what an accessory dwelling unit or even a junior accessory dwelling unit looks like on a lot that has a multifamily dwelling unit on it, which is the unique trait in the California example. If you have a multifamily dwelling, then what is an accessory dwelling to a multifamily?
Okay, I can comment on that too, because I lived in Connecticut where there were a lot of those.
Where else do you live?
I should come to Maryland.
I grew up in Connecticut. I don't live in Colorado and Rhode Island.
10 seconds.
In Connecticut, I mean, this was old stuff, but people would have a duplex and then there'd be an outhouse in the, not an outhouse, but an outbuilding. So you'd have, the main address and then you have B in the back. So their address is, it's a nice little house in the backyard.
On my street.
Of a 2 or 3 family house. But it's very common in Massachusetts.
I mean, I see how it manifests itself. I just don't know that it qualifies as an accessory use.
But
I just wonder.
Well, I guess it could be
The dwelling.
Yeah.
Okay, we are up to our public comment time. So after that quick rapid fire, take a look at Montana, go back and take a look at Montana, think about it, okay? Because what we're going to do is allow our time for in-person here in the room, public comment. I would encourage folks that are online, put stuff in the chat. As you've been listening, we're capturing all of that. And then once we get any comments, we'll come back to Montana and then we'll do a big closing round. I want to hear from everybody out there of where you're at on some of this. So in the room, what do we have? Comments?
Yeah, I do. I just have 2 comments. One thing that I would say, in my experience, homes, I'm also a realtor, so homes that have ADUs, especially separate structures, they actually carry a higher market value. So, I mean, I've heard some of the talks about, well, the impact on the market value of the community and whatnot. However, because people are looking for more affordable spaces, and because people are looking for smaller spaces, and because people have family extenuating circumstances, so on and so forth, these options become very, very popular and command a higher price point value per home versus a home. And this is even if you have a fully converted basement that's a full apartment. That home is going to sell for more than a home with the same space and the same basement, but that basement hasn't been already converted. And I can tell you that when you have a basement that hasn't been converted, that is what the people are thinking, I can possibly convert this. So these are things that should be really considered when we're, going through these policies. And then the other thing is, I think that the ADU policies would be better implemented by lot sizes in general, rather than general zoning areas, because you can have situations where the lot size will permit what the person wants, but because they're in a certain zone and everybody else's lot doesn't permit it, then they get penalized. And I've run into that on several different examples, working with clients and even in my own specific home area. So those are the 2 things that I want to point out today.
Thanks for joining us again today.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Can you state your name again for the record?
Yes, Henry Munoz.
Thanks, Henry. And sir, would you like to make a comment?
Yes.
Please do.
My name is Lynn Harris. I'm the president of Sandtown Winchester Improvement Association. And I would like to know how would this affect people who are poor in poor neighborhoods? And a lot of time we have these businesses that come into the poor neighborhoods and all they want to do is get grant money and then they pull out or they fail or they change it to another type of business. So I would look at like an ADU, but ADU for like poor to lower income families and not to bring all these businesses into the area and create another Pennsylvania Avenue if you're familiar with Pennsylvania and Line Street, you see how it went down. It used to be a great community, but they inundated with all these fly-by-night businesses and grocery stores and chicken places and stuff like that, and also created an atmosphere of criminal activities. And so in Sandtown, we don't want that. If we're gonna do an ADU, do it for the senior citizens, do it for women with children who are trying to make it, housing, I'm talking about buying as well as renting. And it seems like this plan that they have for us for, advancement and futuristic plan, it seems like it's geared for just businesses and not for our community. So I just want you guys to take a look at that.
Thank you. And I'd like to sort of just summarize a couple things, I think, in what you were saying. One is specific to affordability, and two is specific to being used as the keyword dwelling for, people to be residential. And I think the issue with affordability, which we haven't, does tie to these particular topic today, because the more restrictive, the more layers, the harder the process, the higher the cost, because typically that results in a higher price point or cost to build an accessory dwelling unit, which makes it hard to keep the unit affordable. So I just wanted to add on to, I think, those two key points you were making. Thanks for being with us here today. So are there any other public in the room? Everyone's, yes.
I guess the only thing I'd just like to add, so my name is Jeff Delmonic. I work for Howard County Department of Planning and Zoning, specifically in zoning. So if you saw me nodding my head along a lot of the times, it's just very prevalent conversation. That's what I do. The only thing I just wanted to quickly add was that in Howard County, we just finished up our general plan, Book by Design. And as part of that process, there was a huge educational piece on ADUs that we did that was relevant to a lot of what was talked about here about total number of units. There was an analysis that was done. So I have the, I don't know if that was ever looked at. I just wanted to offer that up as something that I could provide. It goes through sort of the specifics on how Howard County regulates currently ADUs and then specifies like the specifics on in our code where that comes from. So I'm happy to provide.
Thank you.
As an additional resource.
And thanks for being here. Yeah, Joe, I assume that's in our inventory.
Can you just repeat his name because they couldn't hear?
Okay.
Yeah, my name was Jeff Delmonic.
The inventory is just of the ordinances themselves.
Okay.
We don't have that analysis.
Okay.
So that to then quantify the potential ADUs that could be developed?
So it's a review in the past 5 years. So it's the numbers are actually, I just pulled it up. It's 99 total dwelling units. Now we have specifics, as you just rightly pointed out. For us, we pretty much permit attached accessory dwelling units. Then we do have a 2-family dwelling conditional use process that people can go through, which is very rare. And then even more rare is a temporary accessory dwelling unit process, which allows pretty much restrictions on it has to be for family and it can only be temporary. So you pretty much have to knock it down as soon as it's not being used. So and there's been one that's been permitted over the past 5 years. So it's a 5-year time frame. It's not a projection.
That'd be great if we could add it to the quantitative.
Yeah. That would be lovely.
We could add it to our panel in December.
Is there anyone else in the room that I'm missing that is a guest or someone, public comment? Okay. Joe, are there any comments that you might want to just read off or anything?
Well, we're having some weird issues with the comments. Chuck's getting them on his screen, but I'm not getting them on my screen.
Okay.
I was gonna chat.
There's a lot of comments.
There are.
And we're gonna make sure that we get into everyone and because they're chatting and responding
to each other
at the real time of your conversation. So it probably isn't worthwhile for me to go read them, but hopefully people can go back and review them.
Yeah, I'll send the chats from the past 2 meetings.
So maybe we just create a section in the folder that's very specific to all of the comments coming in. So we have that because we have to take that into consideration. Okay, then. Well, we appreciate the people that came here. So we're going to try to kind of bring it in now, right? Let's go back to Montana for a minute, just because we didn't get a chance to quite talk about Montana. And then I'm gonna, just to give you all fair warning, we're gonna do a round robin. And you're each going to be asked to identify what the ideal ordinance would be from your standpoint as it relates to this specific topic of as of right, conditional use exception. What would you put in into that? So that's your current homework assignment. Well, we also multitask and look at Montana. Any comments on Montana?
I think this one's unique because it still hasn't gone into effect. It's like, it's coming up. So, it gives you the perspective as, I'm not gonna foresee what the task force recommends, but if there is any state legislation, it's obviously in the future. And so it gives you that perspective.
Yeah, the key words is shall adopt, allow a minimum of one on a lot or parcel that contains a single family unit. So they're basically saying you're gonna adopt this and you're gonna make it allowable. And, then there's more details that you all can read, but I think this is what we're struggling with here, right? Like and I'm gonna say we're going there, but we're only making recommendations here. But, if the state of Maryland were to feel like this is so important to affect the 0.5% of our housing market, what should Maryland do? We're going to have to make these advisory recommendations. And so that is, so today, Joe, go back to and remind us of our challenge for today, which is specific to the topic. You can go back to that. I think that was kind of at the beginning of what we have to kind of come together and reach some outcome on this special, on the as of right, the topic we're all just talked about. Okay, never mind.
Come on.
I can do that. So today we were focusing on the by right versus conditional and special exception. So if in the best of possible worlds, from your perspective, what are there you don't have to be precise, but if there are observations of what you would like to see occur as a by right, are there aspects that you would like to see as part of a conditional or special exception? I'm not going to split hairs on one or the other, even though they're different, but because they require a bigger review process. Think of it that way. What should those be? For instance, I heard, well, historic and conservation districts are different, so they should be handled differently. I heard earlier in some of your comments that, the parking can't be overly restricted. So we're going to do the round robin and to the best that you can. Just share what you think should be as right and should be allowed versus those items that you think should go through some type of more of an approval process beyond just the zoning administrator looking at it. And we're going to start, I'm going to use my list, because that might be the easiest way. And unfortunately, it says, no, I don't think it is in alphabetical. No, we are going to start with Senator Washington, who's at the top of my list. And I'm just going to go down through my list.
That's fair. I think I think I would lean towards a by right because in a sense all of these are going to have to go through some sort of local approval. So, but specifically, I think I would focus on single family housing and that looking at allowing for, I think what has sometimes referred to as middle housing. So while I'm a by right, it's not, I'm saying that knowing that there's nowhere in the state of Maryland where a developer or somebody can just come in and just put in whatever they want to. So that's where I'm leaning.
Thank you. And just to sort of make sure everyone's clear, when we say by right, there's still zoning in place. Right. You're still following the underlying zoning. You're still following all of that. And there is still the zoning administrator that has to review it and ensure that you're meeting, the setbacks and the other types of things that would go with that. We're just saying the ability to put an accessory dwelling unit on your lot in your particular zone should be something that should be allowed by right with simply coming in and zoning administrator versus public hearings and all of these other layers of things. So I just want to be clear on that one.
And then the other is just removed, and that the reason is that removes a barrier. And so that to me would be the other things put in barriers. So this is sort of removing all, and then each case can be built out. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think just as Senator Washington did, I mean, you don't have to have your whole laundry list, but if there's something that really comes to the forefront of your mind, this is your chance to just make sure that that's noted. Delegate Stewart, did you end up joining us anywhere along the way? We haven't seen him come on. Okay, then we'll just move to the next one. That's me. Okay, so on to Theo.
Oh, you skip your.
I'm passing. I have to facilitate. I'll get my crack at this. I have to stay neutral.
Yeah, I mean, I am the secretary. I do not believe that ADUs should go through a special exemption process. I mean, it definitely should be allowed by right, with the exception of, where it is reasonable, such as a critical area or a historic preservation district. Definitely, should be as permissible as possible. And if there are going to be conditions, the conditions should be reasonable, but still allow for its creation. So some conditions that would be problematic would be owner occupancy requirements or parking restrictions that are really more than one parking spot per unit realistically. So definitely want it to be as permissible as possible.
Great, thank you. Very clear, very confident of that. Very good.
Discussed it already.
Okay, Lori.
So I just I agree with you on the special exception. I think my concern with that process, I would think we need a policy to guide the counties because it can be a lengthy, time consuming and arduous process. So if we're gonna make it where that's an option, give some policy or some guidance on that. I think by right is definitely where I'm leaning to. I agree with the senator with respect to the single family housing. I think we need to really talk about that lot size. I think it also goes to your comment of, this is something that could, you can age in place. You could do a lot of things with that, but I do feel like the lot size needs to be considered. And the last thing I will say is when we're looking at a recommendation, I think we really need to take into account the rural, the urban, the historic, the conservation, and maybe even address them individually as a by right. Because when you don't, you're going to have that process that this doesn't apply, this doesn't work in my county. So I think if we're going to do a by right, I think if we can give more guidance on the rural, urban, historic, and the conservation.
Wonderful, great summary, thank you. Next on to Amy.
I'm in agreement that an accessory dwelling unit should be defined and should be a by right use. I don't think that there is a need to create a special exception or specific conditions for a special exception. I would further state that I'm not sure that there's a great need to get into the weeds about where an accessory dwelling unit should be given extra conditions or extra oversight in terms of, is it in a historic district? Is it in the critical area? I think that if you have many by right uses, there are other applicable codes. So I think you run the danger of overthinking, over legislating, over recommending, kind of like the California example. Just because you have a right to do it doesn't mean it's going to be desirable or it'll work under other circumstances. I feel that this is a reasonable use and that there's a reasonable expectation that an accessory dwelling is a reasonable accessory use to a residential dwelling.
Great, thanks. Okay, we're going to keep moving here. James, online, what's your closing thought?
My closing thoughts is we seem to be moving along perfectly, creating policy for the future. Like I said, the only thing I'm concerned about, and I realize some people frown on this, is just the overuse, if you will, of city services or town services as you put in the ADUs and things of that nature. And we just need to be cognizant of that. Smaller towns are taxed heavily, and more residents don't necessarily equate to more revenue. And so that's an issue that I would definitely have to be concerned about.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we'll be touching on that more, I think, later on some of our other topic areas, I think, coming up. Yes.
Like facilities and infrastructure.
Yeah, we'll have more of a deep dive on that later, James. And so I think clearly that is of concern to many. So, but you kind of, if I was hearing you right, you're kind of in agreement with some of what you were hearing so far regarding the by right, the exceptions, but with that overriding concern.
Most
about-
definitely. Yeah, I am definitely, yep. Everything that's gone on today is perfect.
Wonderful. Thank you. Councilman Ha.
He might be off.
Did we lose him? Was he the one driving?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, we'll keep
No,
going.
he's not off the
He
road.
told me that he was going to an appointment.
Okay, no, I know he's tuning in, and this is all recorded. David Thaler, are you out there?
David is. You're not here twice.
David? Are you with us? Muted? We'll circle back to David so we can keep moving. Tiffany?
So a lot of what I think has already been said, but definitely leaning on the side of by right. I will agree with Lori that I think that if there aren't specifications for the different areas, that it's just gonna be haywire. I think there needs to be some direction in an initial policy, but then specified to whether this is what you can do urban areas, the historic areas. I think that's gonna be helpful with more people getting on board with wanting to do it.
Okay, but I'm hearing a key word here, both of you, which was guidance.
Yes.
And it's sort of, I think, building on what Amy said, it's sort of like, it's probably there already, but I think people may not know that. And so the ability to have that guidance, I think, is what I'm hearing could really just help with people becoming comfortable.
Yes,
Yeah.
guidance, yes, not
Yep.
legislation.
That's great. Just want to confirm that's what we were all saying. Quinn, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. And I would just like to echo majority of the comments. I too am leaning towards the by right aspect of things. I will say that as an attorney, we make our living on subjective definitions and the gray area. But I do think that in this particular instance, when it does involve and impact so many individuals, people, the lay people, they like to have clear guidance on what can and cannot be, established on their property. And I think it's something that we should keep in mind. So again, clear guidance, but try not to overstep those boundaries if we are making recommendations. But again, leaning more towards the by right aspect of things.
Great, thanks, Quinn. And I think what you said also just prompted something for me. We have to keep in mind, this is usually happening most of the time on an individual property owner who it is not in their world to necessarily be reading zoning or want to hire an attorney. Sorry, Quinn. And so simple is better if we don't want to just kind of shut them down just by opening the book, right? So I think there is something to be said for that in terms of the reality of who the audience is here. So thank you. So the next one, Deborah.
To me, Theo hit the nail on the head when you brought up the example of California and how many people are not actually doing this. And although California has its own reasons, that we will not also fall under, there are going to be limitations to building them. And people all homeowners can go and buy a shed from Home Depot for $1,800. Are they all doing that? No, they have their various reasons for not doing that and putting that in their backyard. Some people want their backyard, some people want the space to store their things. So I think, sorry, that was a bit off topic, but I think, yes, as right, we say as right, we're not, I think we're, like, it feels like it's in safe territory.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think understanding those reasons is helpful. Maybe some of that'll come out in the focus groups and the panels and stuff too. Great, Priscilla.
I also support the by right, but I have a couple of things I would like to make sure that are in there, and I have a couple of things that I'm really struggling with. I really think that short-term rentals are just gonna be just a hole that we don't want to go down, a big rabbit hole. And I would not support that in the legislation. I think a specific definition of ADU saying livable space and no minimum, but a maximum square footage, I think would be really important. The thing I really struggle with is the owner occupied. And that comes up in some things and not in others, and I just don't know what the right answer is on that. And I do have a question that has nothing to do with this part of it, but I wonder how ADUs affect the property valuation for tax purposes.
Well, that's something we're trying to get that.
Yeah, from, we may or may not get that from staff, but I'm also hoping that that's something that the intern can help us with. It might not be Maryland specific, but we're hoping that there's some research and literature out there that somebody has looked at that specifically, how ADUs have affected property values. We're still working with that staff.
If it increases the property value, then it increases the property tax, and then the municipalities level of more money to spend. And
so we're going to try to get as much quantifiable information.
And if anybody, I think, remember the public mentioned that it did increase the value.
Yeah.
If anybody has any research that has demonstrated.
Any
that
citing.
impact, please send it my way, and then I'll get to the.
Okay, we have 5 minutes and 4 more people. Mandy, online, are you still with us?
I am. I just wanted to mention certified interior designers, architects, general contractors. We all adhere to International Building Code. All jurisdictions that I've worked in Maryland have adopted some form of International Building Code. International Residential Code defines a dwelling unit, and they define it as a single unit providing complete independent living facilities for one or more persons, including permanent provisions for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. I'm happy to put this definition up on our team's meeting, but as we are already, implementing International Building Code, I think we should maybe possibly look into defining the dwelling unit as how jurisdictions are already defining the dwelling unit. The accessory piece, yes, but a dwelling unit is kind of already defined from an interior design standpoint.
Yes, please share and let's make sure we get that language in the glossary.
Yes, I'll be happy to.
Yep. Yeah.
And as by right or conditional, I think by right and conditional on the local jurisdictions, I think clear definitions of what has to be the requirement for that is important, because as we speak to urban, rural, there's variances, and authorities having jurisdictions can, stipulate what is best for their communities.
Okay, so you're saying you're feeling that the local jurisdiction should determine if it's by right or a conditional or exception?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, Jennifer.
A lot's been said already.
But
So very much agree. I love that using the IBC. One of the things, and I wrote this down of what you had said earlier, of accessory use to the primary use, and keeping that at the forefront of our mind, which I think also gets to the dwelling side is in there, which addresses the businesses and other things coming into that space, that we are looking at accessory dwelling units. Overarching, I do believe that by right is the, you know, looking at that California example is the best practice. While there are other, and I love the point you brought up, that there's so many documents out there that really do help, you know, mitigate the historic districts. I have that overarching concern of that community that might not have it and somehow having again, should it not be addressed locally, there should be an overarching structure. Outside of that, I mentioned it earlier in my mind, I'm just visualizing almost the executive summary of this action being a flow chart for that individual user to pick up and say like, yes, okay, no, and I go here. Because that point is very well taken of this is an individual citizen, most likely looking to do this, and we should have a document and we should have something that's essentially the cheat sheet of how to go about this.
Yeah, I kind of have that visual too. That's great. Thank you. Chelsea.
I'll keep it brief. I think that by right makes the most sense for the reasons that Theo stated. I mean, we have an affordable housing crisis, so it would be a great mechanism for trying to address the housing needs of older adults and people with disabilities.
And I think I heard earlier from you about the need, particularly for people with disabilities, to allow it separate facility.
Yeah.
Unit, not requiring it to be attached to the existing.
Yeah, and certain features that are around the unit that allow for someone with a wheelchair to easily access the unit to be able to, so I mean, that would be the only situation where I think that, you know, something like alleyway access might be challenging for a person in a wheelchair or who uses an assistive device. That's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think we have to keep those things in mind, particularly with some of the population that we might be supporting with this. So Isabella, did she join us?
Councilmember Hoff is back on.
Who is?
Dan Hoff, Councilmember Hoff.
Oh, okay. Did we miss him?
Well, remember he was.
Yes.
Was driving. And
Oh, okay. Councilman Hoff, did you want to weigh in before we close the meeting? You're on mute.
He might still be logged in.
Okay, you might still be driving.
And David Taylor is still on, but I'm not sure.
David, did you want to add anything in before we close out? Okay, he might not be able to either. So we are doing well. It's 12:01. Yes, next steps, and then I'll close this out.
Okay. So we've already started to form the panel and focus groups, but I'm going to be following up with a lot of you. That's the big next step. Continue to gather the quantitative ADU development data. Thank you for the offer from Howard County. We talked a lot today about the glossary of terms. I'll put a document up in the team site. We can all start adding to that. MDP will start it off, juice it. So we're continuing the practical issues review by topic area like we did today. So next time there's a lot of talk about lot sizes. That's good because that's the topic, or not just lot size, but lot requirements is the topic for the next meeting. So we'll bring the same kind of practical and issue analysis to the next one and the other ones. We're gonna keep on crafting these preliminary legislative policy recommendations. You gave us a lot to work with today. Thank you. If you all have any resources, keep adding them to the Microsoft Teams site. And as a reminder, the next meeting is December 19th in this room at 9 o'clock.
And we're going to keep doing it here. We've just found logistically, it's just the only way we can count on the technology and be able to. So we'll do everything we can to make your trip in as easily as possible. We appreciate you being here in person. So you're good, Joe? I think we're going to close it out then. I'm just going to thank everybody because I am just so impressed by the level of expertise and thoughtfulness we have around this table. I mean, this is really a great group. And I am absolutely confident we're going to come out of this with a good product that we can feel proud of. And it's all going to be because of, yes, staff is working extremely hard, but you all are really participating. And I appreciate that. I think this is really going to be a huge outcome. So thank you again for your time. Thank you for being here. These are big commitments, 3 hours once a month, plus all the extras we're asking for you. But there is an end point in June. So this is the thing I love about a task force kind of thing. It's like it doesn't go on and on and on. We will get to an end point. So if you can hang with us, I appreciate the level of participation we're getting. I mean, we've only had a couple people missing in each instance. So I'm hoping we can keep up that participation. So Thanks, everyone. See you in a few weeks. Take care. Signing off. Thank you all out there.